Somewhere on Earth, right now, communities and places as scattered as India, Japan, and Southern Africa claim a startling heritage. They see themselves as descendants of the 10 lost tribes of Israel, a people swallowed by the mists of history over 2.5 millennia ago when the mighty Assyrian Empire deported them into oblivion. Their story, a profound historical mystery, represents a loose thread in a vast tapestry, a question mark hanging at the end of a sentence that began long, long before. To understand how a people could be lost, we must first go back to the very beginning, to a time when they were not yet a nation, not even a tribe, but merely a promise whispered to one man under the vast, star-dusted sky of ancient Mesopotamia. We are going to trace that story from its hazy, dreamlike origins, following the thread from that single promise to the rise of kings, the building of temples, the agony of exile, and the final defiant struggles against the greatest empire the world had ever known. This is a story of faith and failure, of divine encounters and very human betrayals, a story that has profoundly shaped our world in ways we often don't even realize. I'm glad you're here, wishing you peace, rest, and maybe a little historical inspiration before sleep. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love to see how far the stories is traveling tonight, so please feel free to post your location and local time in the comments below. It's a wonderful way to feel connected as we settle in and drift back in time together. Our journey begins not in Israel, but far to the east, in the land between the rivers, Mesopotamia. The air here, in the 2nd millennium before Christ, is thick with the dust of crumbling empires and the smoke of new cities rising from the plains. The world is a patchwork of powerful city-states and nomadic peoples, all swirling around the life-giving waters of the Tigris and Euphrates. This is the world of the Middle Bronze Age, a time of cuneiform tablets, of grand ziggurats piercing the sky, and of gods whose appetites and angers shaped the lives of mortals. In the great city of Ur, a bustling metropolis of commerce and religion near the Persian Gulf, a man named Abram lived. The stories that would later be written down about him place him here, in this sophisticated urban world, before a call would send him on a journey that would change the course of history. He wasn't a king, or a general, or a great philosopher. He was, by all accounts, the head of a semi-nomadic clan, a wealthy pastoralist whose net worth was measured in hoofbeats, in sheep, goats, and cattle. And in a world where a person's identity was fused to their city, their land, and their pantheon of local gods, Abram receives a strange and singular command from a deity he calls Yahweh. Leave everything. Leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to a land that I will show you. It's a staggering request, akin to being told today to abandon your citizenship, liquidate your assets, and start walking toward a destination you'll only recognize when you get there. The promise attached to this command is just as staggering. I will make you into a great nation. For Abram and his wife, Sarai, this promise was laced with a quiet, private pain. They were childless, and in their culture, to be without an heir was to be a dead end, a final, silent link in the chain of your ancestors. The journey they undertook was not a random wandering. The path from southern Mesopotamia up towards Haran in modern-day Turkey and then south into the land of Canaan follows a well-trodden route known as the Fertile Crescent. This was a superhighway of ancient trade and migration. Archaeologists see in this story a reflection of a known historical phenomenon, the westward migrations of Amorite peoples during this very period. It's one of those fascinating points of contact where the biblical narrative seems to echo the broader movements of history, lending it a texture of plausibility. This is a recurring theme we will encounter, the historical mystery of it all. There is no inscription reading, "Abram was here," no archaeological layer that proves his existence, and frankly, we wouldn't expect one. A small, semi-nomadic clan moving through the landscape would leave behind little more than scattered campfire stones and perhaps some broken pottery, ephemeral traces that the centuries would surely erase. Yet what scholars find so compelling is how the details of the patriarchal stories, the laws of inheritance, the marriage customs, the tribal politics, fit so neatly not with the later time when they were written down, but with the much earlier Middle Bronze Age, the very period in which these figures are said to have lived. Legal tablets discovered at sites like Nutsi and Mari describe adoption practices and surrogate motherhood arrangements that are strikingly similar to the story of Sarai giving her maidservant Hagar to Abram to bear a child. It's as if a detailed memory of a specific cultural era was preserved, passed down through generations of oral storytelling, a ghost of a real past haunting a much later text. The promise of nationhood finally begins to take root with the miraculous birth of a son to Abram and Sarai in their old age, Isaac. Their names are changed to Abraham and Sarah, signifying a new destiny. The covenant is established, a pact between this family and their God, sealed with the ritual of circumcision. The story feels both intimate and epic, a family drama playing out on a geopolitical stage. Abraham's faith is tested in the most harrowing way imaginable when he is asked to sacrifice Isaac, the very embodiment of the promise. It's a deeply unsettling story, a window into a remote and sometimes terrifying ancient mindset, but it ends with the reaffirmation of the divine pledge. The torch is passed to Isaac, a quieter, more pastoral figure who acts as the bridge between the dynamic founder, Abraham, and his own tempestuous son, Jacob. And it is with Jacob that the family saga truly ignites with conflict and complexity. Jacob, the younger twin, is the clever trickster, the heel grabber who cons his rough, outdoorsman brother, Esau, out of both his birthright and his father's blessing. He is a flawed and relatable character, driven by ambition and fear. Fleeing Esau's murderous rage, he journeys back to the family's ancestral homeland in Haran, where he himself is tricked by his uncle Laban into marrying two sisters, Leah and Rachel, and working for 20 years to build his own wealth. Jacob's life is defined by struggle, most famously in a mysterious, night-long wrestling match with a divine being by the river Jabbok. At dawn, wounded but undefeated, he is given a new name, Israel, which means one who struggles with God. This name would come to define the nation that descended from him. He who wrestled with the divine would become the father of a people whose entire history is a story of wrestling with God, with their neighbors, and with themselves. Jacob returns to Canaan a changed man, the father of 12 sons by his 2 wives and their maidservants. These 12 sons are the legendary progenitors of the 12 tribes of Israel. The family is now a clan, a burgeoning nation in miniature, their internal jealousies and rivalries already hinting at the fractures that would one day split a kingdom. As our first chapter closes, this family, this nascent nation named Israel, finds itself facing a severe famine in the land of Canaan, forcing them to look south toward the inexhaustible breadbasket of the ancient world, the mighty and intimidating kingdom of Egypt. The land of Canaan was drying up, the earth cracking under a relentless sun, and the once reliable rains had become a distant memory. For the sprawling family of Jacob, now known as Israel, the famine was an existential threat, a slow-moving disaster that promised to wither their future, just as it had withered the fields around them. Their gaze and their hope turned toward Egypt, a civilization whose very existence was a monument to the taming of nature. The Nile, with its predictable, life-giving flood, made Egypt the ancient world's bastion of stability, a place of colossal stone gods and overflowing granaries. It was to this powerful and alien land that Jacob's sons traveled in search of grain, unaware that they were walking into a story that had begun decades earlier, a story of betrayal that was about to become their salvation. The architect of that salvation was their own brother, Joseph, whom they had last seen as a teenager being dragged away by slave traders. He had been their father's favorite, a dreamer whose apparent arrogance had fueled their jealousy to a murderous pitch. Selling him into slavery seemed, at the time, a neat solution. But in the strange and often ironic unfolding of this narrative, their act of cruelty had placed Joseph exactly where he needed to be. In Egypt, his journey had been a dramatic roller coaster of fate, from favored slave in a high official's house to a prisoner forgotten in a dungeon after being falsely accused, and finally to the very pinnacle of power. His uncanny ability to interpret dreams, a gift that had once earned him his brother's scorn, had brought him before Pharaoh himself. He had foretold the very famine that now gripped the region, 7 years of abundance to be followed by 7 years of devastating want. And for his wisdom, Pharaoh had made him vizier, second in command over all of Egypt. When his unsuspecting brothers bowed before him, begging for food, they were confronted with a ghost from their past. Now dressed in fine Egyptian linen, a man who held their lives in his hands. What followed was a masterfully orchestrated test of their character, a series of deceptions and revelations designed to see if the cruel young men he once knew had grown into men of conscience. It culminates in a moment of raw, cathartic emotion as Joseph finally reveals himself, weeping so loudly that the sound carries through the palace. The story is a deeply human one, a tale of family dysfunction, long-held guilt, and the staggering possibility of forgiveness. Their past crime, he told them, was part of a design larger than their jealousy. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, so. And so, the clan of Israel was invited to leave the famine-stricken lands of Canaan and settle in Egypt. They were given the best of the land, the lush, well-watered region of Goshen in the eastern Nile Delta. This was a perfect place for pastoralists, a buffer zone between the agricultural heartland of Egypt and the deserts of the Sinai. Here, the small family of some 70 souls, as the tradition counts them, began to thrive. For centuries, they lived in peace, multiplying in number, a distinct people living within the protective shadow of a greater empire. Now, this story of a Semitic family finding welcome and prosperity in Egypt raises a fascinating question for historians. Is there a plausible context for this? And the answer is a tentative yes. The narrative seems to align remarkably well with a specific period of Egyptian history known as the Second Intermediate Period, when Lower Egypt was ruled by a dynasty of kings known as the Hyksos. The Hyksos were not native Egyptians. They were a people of West Asian or Semitic origin. Culturally, they were cousins to the Israelites. For them to welcome other Semitic groups, like Joseph's family, into the Delta would have been standard practice. A man like Joseph rising to a position of great power would not have been unthinkable under their rule. The historical puzzle pieces seem to click into place. But this also provides a chilling context for what happened next. Around 1550 BCE, a powerful dynasty of native Egyptian pharaohs rose in the south, launching a war of liberation that drove the Hyksos out of Egypt. This established the New Kingdom, a period of immense power, wealth, and fervent Egyptian nationalism. The biblical text captures this dramatic political shift in a single ominous sentence. Then a new king, who did not know Joseph, came to power in Egypt. For the Hebrews in Goshen, the world had changed. They were now the remnants of a distrusted foreign population, their prosperity seen as a threat. The new pharaoh, likely one of the great builders of the new kingdom, like Seti I or Rameses II, saw in this burgeoning population not an asset, but a potential fifth column, a security risk on his northeastern frontier. The solution was brutal and pragmatic: enslavement. The once honored guests were turned into a state-owned labor force. Their days became an endless cycle of grueling toil under a punishing sun. Imagine the stench of the mud and straw, the rhythmic thud of wooden molds, the burning in the muscles from dawn until dusk. They were tasked with building the great store cities of Pithom and Ramesses, monumental projects designed to project the pharaoh's power, built on the backs of a broken people. Fear and paranoia drove the Egyptian policy. When the forced labor failed to curb the Hebrews' population growth, Pharaoh issued a horrific decree. Every son born to the Hebrews was to be drowned in the Nile. It was an act of systematic genocide aimed at extinguishing the future of the Israelite people. It is in this crucible of suffering and despair that a Savior is born. A woman from the tribe of Levi hides her newborn son for 3 months, and when she can hide him no longer, she places him in a waterproof basket of reeds and sets him adrift on the river, entrusting his fate to the very waters meant to be his grave. The basket is found not by a soldier, but by Pharaoh's own daughter. In an act of compassion that defies her father's decree, she takes the child as her own, naming him Moses, which in Egyptian can mean is born, as in Thutmose or Rameses, but in Hebrew sounds like the verb to draw out of water. Through a stroke of luck, or perhaps divine providence, the baby's own mother is hired as his wet nurse, ensuring that the boy raised as an Egyptian prince would never forget the language and lineage of his enslaved people. Moses grows up a man of two worlds, fluent in the ways of the palace, yet bound by blood to the slaves in the mud pits. This divided identity comes to a violent head when he sees an Egyptian taskmaster beating one of his brethren. In a flash of rage, he strikes the Egyptian down and buries him in the sand. But the secret gets out. Moses, the prince of Egypt, is a wanted man. He flees eastward across the Sinai Peninsula to the land of Midian, where he trades his royal linen for the simple robes of a shepherd. For years, he lives a quiet life, marrying and starting a family, his past seemingly buried like the body in the sand. But one day, while tending his flock on the slopes of Mount Horeb, a strange sight catches his eye: a desert bush engulfed in flames, yet refusing to burn. As he draws closer, a voice calls his name from the heart of the fire, identifying itself as the God of his ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This is the moment of his commission, the divine command to return to the heart of the empire he fled and confront the most powerful man on earth. He is to demand the impossible, the release of Pharaoh's entire slave labor force. Moses, the hesitant shepherd, the stammering fugitive, is to be the instrument of liberation. And so, armed with little more than a shepherd's staff and a divine name, he and his brother Aaron make their way back to Egypt, walking through the great pylons of the palace to stand before the living God King and deliver the audacious message that would set two powers on a collision course. Let my people go. Pharaoh, the living embodiment of the Egyptian state and a god in the eyes of his people, was not a man accustomed to being told what to do, least of all by a pair of outcasts representing a nation of slaves. The demand to let my people go was met with the contempt one might expect. It was to him an absurdity, an insult to his power and to the gods of Egypt who sanctioned it. His response was not negotiation, but punishment. He intensified the Israelites' suffering, issuing a decree that they must now gather their own straw for brick-making, while still meeting the same daily quota. It was a masterful stroke of cruelty, designed to crush their spirits and turn them against their would-be deliverers, Moses and Aaron. The lash fell harder, the work became impossible, and a wave of despair washed over the slave pits. Hope, it seemed, was a dangerous and costly thing. What followed was not a battle of armies, but a contest of divine power, a systematic and terrifying dismantling of the Egyptian cosmos. The 10 plagues unfolded as a series of devastating blows, each one seemingly targeted at a cornerstone of Egyptian belief. When the Nile, the very lifeblood of the kingdom and the domain of the god Hapi, turned to blood, it was more than an ecological disaster. It was a theological statement. The land was then swarmed by a plague of frogs, a grotesque mockery of Heket, the frog-headed goddess of fertility. Swarms of gnats and flies, plagues on livestock that attacked the sacred bulls and cows associated with deities like Apis and Hathor, all served to demonstrate that the God of the Hebrews held power over the domains of Egypt's most revered gods. With each plague, Moses and Aaron would issue their warning, and with each plague, Pharaoh's pride would swell. The narrative describes his heart as being hardened, a potent phrase capturing that stubborn, self-destructive pride that refuses to yield even in the face of catastrophe. It was a downward spiral of defiance, each refusal to bend inviting a greater disaster, culminating in a darkness so profound it could be felt, a direct assault on the supreme power of the sun god, Ra. The final plague was the most dreadful. A warning was issued. At midnight, the angel of death would pass through the land of Egypt, and the firstborn in every household, from the heir of Pharaoh on his throne to the firstborn of the captive in the dungeon, would die. For the Israelites, there was a single, strange instruction for survival. Each family was to take a perfect, unblemished lamb, slaughter it, and paint its blood upon the doorposts of their home. They were to roast the lamb and eat it in haste, with unleavened bread and bitter herbs, their sandals on their feet, and their staff in their hand, ready to leave at a moment's notice. That night, as a great cry of mourning rose from every Egyptian home, the destroyer passed over the houses marked by the blood of the Lamb. This event, the Passover, would be seared into the collective memory of Israel, becoming the foundational story of their identity, the moment of their violent birth as a free people. Jolted from his pride by his own grief, Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron in the dead of night and told them to go, to take everyone and everything and leave. The exodus began in a frantic rush, a vast multitude of people and livestock fleeing into the night, carrying with them the unleavened dough on their backs, because there had been no time to wait for it to rise. Their freedom, however, was short-lived. Once the initial shock and grief wore off, Pharaoh's regret turned to rage. He had lost his slave labor force. Mustering his elite force of 600 chariots, the ancient world's equivalent of a tank division, he pursued the fleeing Israelites, trapping them against the shore of a large body of water, traditionally the Red Sea, though many scholars suggest it may have been one of the marshy lakes, the Sea of Reeds, farther north. For the Israelites, it was a moment of pure terror. The Egyptian army was closing in behind them. The impassable water lay before them. Their short-lived freedom felt like a cruel joke. And it is here that the narrative reaches its spectacular climax. As Moses stretched his staff out over the water, a great wind blew all night, pushing the sea back and creating a path on dry ground, with the water forming a wall to their right and to their left. Through this impossible corridor, the Israelites fled. The Egyptians, blinded by their pursuit, charged in after them. But once the last Israelite was safe on the other side, the waters collapsed, swallowing the entire Egyptian army, its horses, and its chariots. On the far shore, the Israelites watched as the bodies of their former masters washed up on the sand. The threat was over. They were truly, finally, free. The elations of this miraculous deliverance soon gave way to the grim reality of their new home, the vast, inhospitable wilderness of the Sinai. The desert became a testing ground, a crucible that would expose the character of this newly freed people. They were no longer slaves, but they did not yet know how to be a nation. The grumbling began almost immediately. They complained of bitter water, of a lack of food, of a longing for the relative security, the flesh pots of Egypt. In response to their complaints came divine provision, water made sweet, and a strange, bread-like substance called manna that appeared on the ground with the morning dew. After 3 months of travel, they arrived at the foot of a formidable jagged peak in the heart of the desert, Mount Sinai. The mountain was shrouded in a thick, dark cloud, pierced by flashes of lightning and the deep rumble of thunder. The narrative describes God descending upon the mountain in fire, a terrifying and awe-inspiring spectacle that warned the people to keep their distance. Moses, their intermediary, went alone into this terrifying presence, ascending the mountain to meet with the God who had delivered them. It was here, in the fire and smoke, that the relationship between this deity and this people was to be formalized. What Moses received was not merely a set of rules, but the terms of a covenant, a treaty. The structure of this covenant, as laid out in the text, bears a striking resemblance to the suzerainty treaties of the ancient Hittite Empire, where a great king would lay out the obligations and expectations for a vassal state. In this divine treaty, the Ten Commandments formed the core principles. They were the constitution for this new nation, a radical charter that began by establishing the exclusive sovereignty of Yahweh and went on to lay out a blueprint for a just and ethical society, a society that honored parents, respected life, forbade theft and adultery, and valued truth. This covenant was an invitation. Israel was to become a kingdom of priests and a holy nation, a people set apart, whose very way of life would be a testament to the God who had chosen them. At the foot of the smoking mountain, the laws were read, and the people, in a moment of collective awe and commitment, agreed to the terms. "Everything the Lord has said," they responded in unison, "we will do." The pact was sealed. The slave rabble that had fled Egypt was now formally constituted as a nation, bound by a covenant to the God who had set them free. In the shadow of the holy mountain, the ink on the new national charter was barely dry, yet the commitment of the people was already proving to be fragile. Moses, their leader and lawgiver, had once again vanished into the terrifying cloud that shrouded the summit of Sinai, communing with the divine presence to receive the finer details of their constitution and the intricate blueprints for a portable sanctuary, the tabernacle. But down below, in the sprawling camp, his prolonged absence began to fester. 40 days is a long time to stare at a smoking mountain. Anxiety curdled into fear, and fear gave way to a familiar, deep-seated impulse. The God who had freed them was invisible, remote, and terrifying. They craved something they could see, something tangible and familiar, a God they could touch, like the ones they had known in Egypt. A crowd gathered around Aaron, Moses' brother and second in command, their voices rising in a chorus of panic and demand. "Come, make us gods who will go before us. As for this fellow Moses, we don't know what has happened to him." In a moment of catastrophic weakness, Aaron complied. He instructed them to bring their golden earrings, and from this wealth he fashioned a molten calf, a familiar symbol of divinity and power in both Egypt and Canaan. The people looked upon the glistening idol and declared, "This is your God, O Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt." It was a stunning act of apostasy, a direct violation of the first and second commandments they had just sworn to uphold. A great festival was declared, a scene of wild revelry, of sacrifices and feasting that devolved into a pagan-style orgy at the foot of the very mountain where they had pledged their exclusive allegiance to Yahweh. When Moses finally descended, carrying 2 stone tablets inscribed by the finger of God, the sight that greeted him was one of an utter and heartbreaking betrayal. His anger, the text says, burned hot. He hurled the tablets to the ground, shattering them at the base of the mountain, a powerful, symbolic act of a covenant broken almost as soon as it was made. What followed was a grim and violent restoration of order and a period of intense intercession as Moses pleaded with God not to wipe out the entire nation for their transgression. The covenant was eventually renewed. A second set of tablets was carved, but the incident of the golden calf left an indelible mark. It revealed a deep-seated weakness in the people, a spiritual immaturity that proved they were not yet ready to inherit the land that had been promised to them. Their journey from Sinai was supposed to be a triumphant march to the borders of Canaan, but it became a long and meandering lesson in nationhood. They were organized tribe by tribe, and at the center of their camp, the newly constructed tabernacle now stood, an elaborate tent shrine housing the Ark of the Covenant, the golden chest containing the renewed law. This tabernacle was the visible, regulated heart of their community, the designated place where the holy presence of God would dwell among them. When they finally reached Kadesh Barnea, on the southern edge of the Promised Land, Moses dispatched 12 spies, one from each tribe, to scout out the territory. After 40 days, they returned. 2 of them, Caleb and Joshua, brought back a cluster of grapes so large it had to be carried on a pole between 2 men, and gave a glowing report of a land flowing with milk and honey, urging the people to trust in God and advance. But the other 10 spies told a different story. They spoke of fortified cities whose walls reached the sky, and of powerful giant-like inhabitants before whom they felt as small as grasshoppers. Their report, born of fear, was like a contagion, spreading panic throughout the entire camp. The people's courage collapsed. They wept and railed against Moses, openly wishing they had died in Egypt or the wilderness, rather than face the fearsome warriors of Canaan. This collective rebellion, this utter failure of faith on the very doorstep of their destiny, was the final straw. The divine judgment was swift and severe. The generation that had experienced the liberation from Egypt, the generation that had trembled at Sinai, had proven itself unfit. They were condemned to wander in the wilderness for 40 years, 1 year for each day the spies were in the land, until every last person of that faithless generation, save for the faithful 2, Joshua and Caleb, had died. Their children, a new generation born and raised in the freedom of the desert, hardened by the wilderness, and disciplined by the covenant, would be the ones to inherit the promise. And so, for 4 decades, they journeyed through the desolate landscapes of the Sinai and the lands east of the Jordan River. It was a time of pruning, of maturing, of slowly shedding a slave mentality. At the end of these long years, a new, tougher, and more cohesive people stood ready. But their original leaders would not be joining them. Aaron died and was buried, and finally Moses himself, now an old man, ascended Mount Nebo. From its peak, he could look out across the Jordan Valley and see the green hills of the Promised Land spread out before him. It was a beautiful but heartbreaking vista. For his own past failures, he was forbidden to enter. His work was done. He passed the mantle of leadership to Joshua, and there, overlooking his life's goal, he died. Under Joshua, the character of the story shifts. The era of wandering is over. The time for conquest has begun. The new generation of Israelites stood poised on the eastern bank of the Jordan River. In a powerful echo of the escape from Egypt, the river waters miraculously parted, allowing the people to cross on dry ground. Their first target was the ancient, formidable city of Jericho. The strategy for its capture, as told in the book of Joshua, was bizarre. There was no siege, no great battle, only a ritual. For 6 days, the Israelite army and priests marched in silent procession around the city walls. On the 7th day, they circled 7 times, and then the priests blew their ram's horns, and the entire army let out a great shout. The mighty walls of Jericho, the story says, simply collapsed. What followed was a swift and brutal campaign, a lightning war that, according to the biblical narrative, swept through the central, southern, and northern parts of Canaan, leaving a trail of conquered cities and subjugated peoples. The land was then systematically divided among the 12 tribes, each receiving its allotted inheritance. The picture painted in the book of Joshua is one of a total, divinely ordained conquest. Here, however, we encounter one of the most significant and fascinating discrepancies between the biblical text and modern archaeology, a true historiographical mystery. For much of the 20th century, archaeologists, often inspired by the biblical account, dug through the ruins of Canaanite cities looking for evidence of this sweeping late 13th century BCE destruction, but they largely didn't find it. The archaeological record tells a more complicated story. The walls of Jericho, for example, seem to have been destroyed centuries before the time of Joshua. The city was barely occupied when the Israelites would have arrived. While a few cities do show destruction layers that fit the time frame, many others mentioned in the conquest narrative show no signs of war at all. This lack of evidence has led scholars to propose alternative models for how Israel emerged in Canaan. One theory, the gradual infiltration model, suggests a mostly peaceful process where nomadic Israelites slowly settled in the sparsely populated Central Highlands, only later coming into conflict with Canaanite city-states. Another, more radical theory, the peasant revolt model, posits that the Israelites were not invaders at all, but were primarily indigenous Canaanite serfs who, inspired by a revolutionary faith in a liberating God named Yahweh, rebelled against their Egyptian and Canaanite overlords. The truth is likely a messy combination of all these things. There were probably some violent conquests, a great deal of gradual settlement, and an absorption of local Canaanite groups who were drawn to the new Israelite confederation and its religion. The dramatic, unified conquest story in the book of Joshua, then, can be understood as a powerful, later theological statement about their claim to the land, a foundational epic that condensed a long and complex process into a single, heroic generation. Regardless of the precise mechanics of their arrival, by the end of the Bronze Age, the hills of Canaan were now home to a loose confederation of tribes, a people called Israel, their 40 years of wandering finally over, but their struggles just beginning. With the generation of Joshua and the conquest now laid to rest, the Israelites settled into a new and precarious existence. They were not a unified nation in any modern sense of the word, but a loose confederation of 12 tribes, each bound by a shared ancestry, a shared covenant, and a shared memory of slavery and liberation. They were a patchwork of clans spread across the central highlands of Canaan, a rugged, limestone landscape of terraced hills and small villages. Down in the fertile plains and along the coast, the old Canaanite city-states, with their sophisticated culture and walled fortifications, remained. And a new, formidable enemy had arrived on the scene, the Philistines, a seafaring people who had settled on the southern coastal plain, bringing with them iron weapons and a highly organized military structure. The Israelites were surrounded, a highland people in a hostile land, And the central question of this next era was whether their fragile tribal alliance and their demanding faith could survive. The Book of Judges, which chronicles this period of roughly 2 centuries, presents this history as a tragic and repeating cycle, a downward spiral of faithlessness and chaos. The narrator lays out the pattern with a sad sense of inevitability. A new generation would arise that had not personally experienced the miracles of the Exodus or the conquest. The allure of their neighbor's culture was strong. The Canaanite gods, Baal and Asherah, were gods of the place, deities of the storm and the soil, whose worship was tied to the agricultural rhythms of the land they now inhabited. Appeasing them seemed like a pragmatic insurance policy for ensuring good harvests. And so, the cycle would begin. The people would sin, turning away from their invisible God to worship visible idols, often sealing these new allegiances by marrying into the local population. In response, they would fall vulnerable to their enemies. God would sell them into the hands of a foreign oppressor, a Moabite king, a Canaanite general, the marauding Midianites, who would dominate them for years. In their suffering, the people would eventually cry out for help, and in response to their cry, God would raise up a deliverer, a judge. The Hebrew word shofet doesn't mean a black-robed magistrate in a courtroom. These were charismatic, spirit-empowered figures, often from obscure backgrounds, who acted as military chieftains to lead a coalition of tribes against the current oppressor. After a successful campaign, the judge would often guide the people for the rest of their life, and the land would have a period of peace. But as soon as that judge died, the cycle would begin anew, often sinking to an even lower level of depravity. This pattern repeats itself more than half a dozen times, a relentless rhythm of sin, oppression, repentance, and deliverance, each rotation leaving the people more broken than the last. The stories of these judges are not tales of pious saints, but of gritty, flawed, and often deeply human folk heroes. There is Deborah, a prophetess and the only female judge, a figure of immense authority who held court under a palm tree. When the Israelites were being crushed by the Canaanite general Sisera and his terrifying fleet of 900 iron chariots, she summoned a reluctant tribal commander named Barak, delivering God's command to face the enemy. Barak agreed, but only if she would go with him. In the ensuing battle, a supernatural downpour turned the battlefield into mud, neutralizing the chariot advantage and leading to a decisive Israelite victory. Sisera himself fled on foot, seeking refuge in the tent of a woman named Jael, who offered him milk and a blanket before driving a tent peg through his temple while he slept, a shocking and brutal end to a brutal man. Then there was Gideon, a man from the weakest clan of his tribe, whom the angel of the Lord found threshing wheat inside a winepress, hiding from the Midianite raiders who swarmed the land each harvest season like locusts. He was a man crippled by doubt, famously demanding a sign from God, not once but twice, using a fleece of wool to confirm his calling. He amassed a huge army, but was commanded to shrink it down to a mere 300 men, so that the victory could be credited to God alone. Armed with nothing but torches concealed in clay jars and ram's horns, Gideon's tiny band launched a daring night raid, shattering the jars and blowing the horns to create the illusion of a massive attacking force, sowing such panic and confusion in the enemy camp that the Midianites turned on and destroyed each other. Yet even this great hero had a dark side. In his later years, he crafted a golden object that became an idol, leading the people right back into the apostasy he had saved them from. Perhaps the most famous and tragic of all the judges was Samson. His story is not of a general leading armies, but of a flawed, passionate individual, a Nazarite consecrated to God from birth, blessed with superhuman strength, but cursed with a fatal weakness for Philistine women. He was a lone wolf champion, a brawling trickster who ripped a lion apart with his bare hands and slaughtered 1,000 Philistines with the jawbone of a donkey. His life was a series of epic feats driven by personal vendettas. His final chapter, the story of his love for Delilah, is a timeless tragedy of betrayal. Hounded by the Philistine lords, she eventually coaxed from him the secret of his strength, his uncut hair. Shorn, captured, blinded, and humiliated, Samson was put on public display in the temple of the Philistine god Dagon. But in a final, desperate prayer, his strength returned for one last act of vengeance. He grasped the central pillars of the temple and brought the entire structure crashing down, killing himself and thousands of his enemies. His life was a perfect metaphor for the nation at the time, endowed with a divine gift and incredible potential, but squandered through a lack of moral discipline and a failure to remain set apart. This entire period is illuminated by the wider historical context. The era of the Judges coincides with what historians call the Late Bronze Age collapse, a time of massive upheaval across the Near East. The great Hittite and Egyptian empires, which had long controlled the region of Canaan, were in sharp decline, creating a power vacuum. Into this vacuum stepped smaller regional players like the Israelites, Philistines, Ammonites, and Moabites, all vying for territory and dominance. The stories in Judges, with their localized conflicts and shifting tribal alliances, perfectly reflect the chaotic and politically fragmented nature of this era. The Israel depicted here is not a kingdom, but a collection of highland villages struggling for survival. The constant threat from better armed and better organized neighbors, especially the Philistines with their monopoly on ironsmithing, created a persistent military crisis that the ad hoc leadership of charismatic judges could not permanently solve. The book's final chapters descend into horrifying tales of idolatry, rape, and a brutal civil war, ending with a haunting refrain that serves as the book's thesis. In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit. The system was breaking down. The desperate need for a more permanent, centralized leadership was becoming painfully clear, paving the way for the people's demand for a king. The era of the Judges was drawing to a close, not with a grand finale, but with a slow, weary sigh of exhaustion. The last of these great charismatic leaders was the prophet Samuel, a man respected throughout the tribes, a figure who had anointed no king, but had commanded the allegiance of a nation through his sheer moral and spiritual authority. But Samuel was old, and his sons, whom he had appointed as his successors, were a profound disappointment. They were corrupt men, twisting justice for bribes, and in their failure, the people saw the failure of the entire system. The old way was no longer enough. The tribal confederation, with its reliance on temporary leaders and volunteer militias, was proving dangerously inadequate against the relentless, expansionist pressure of the Philistines. With their iron weapons, organized armies, and fortified cities, The Philistines represented a modern existential threat that the disjointed Israelite tribes could not consistently repel. A crisis point had been reached. The elders of all the tribes journeyed to Samuel's home in Ramah and laid bare their anxieties. Their demand was revolutionary and unanimous. You are old, and your sons do not follow your ways. Now appoint a king to lead us, such as all the other nations have. The words struck Samuel like a blow. On a practical level, their request was sound political and military strategy. They needed a permanent, central commander to levy a standing army and present a unified front. But on a theological level, it was a profound rejection. Samuel saw it as the people turning their back on the foundational principle of their nation, that Yahweh and Yahweh alone was their king. He warned them of the true cost of monarchy, painting a grim picture of what a king would do. He would conscript their sons for his army and his chariots. He would take their daughters to be his perfumers and cooks. He would tax their finest fields and vineyards, and ultimately he would reduce them to his servants. But the people would not be dissuaded. We want a king over us, they insisted. Then we will be like all the other nations, with a king to lead us and to go out before us and fight our battles. The man chosen for this new and weighty office was by all accounts an unlikely candidate. His name was Saul, from the tribe of Benjamin, the smallest and least distinguished of all the tribes of Israel. The text introduces him not as a cunning politician or a seasoned warrior, but as a young man of remarkable physical presence, a head taller than anyone else, sent on a mundane errand to find his father's lost donkeys. He was not seeking a throne. He was looking for livestock. It was during this fruitless search that he was guided to the prophet Samuel, who had been privately instructed by God that this tall Benjamite was the man he was to anoint. In a quiet, private ceremony, Samuel poured a vial of oil over Saul's head, anointing him as Israel's first king. But even after this, when the tribes were gathered and the new king was to be presented to the public through the casting of sacred lots, Saul's reluctance was on full display. When his name was chosen, he was nowhere to be found. They eventually discovered him hiding among the baggage, a man seemingly overwhelmed by the destiny that had been thrust upon him. For this humble, hesitant man to truly become a king in the eyes of the people, he needed to prove himself a capable military leader. The opportunity came swiftly. The Ammonites, an enemy from the east, laid siege to the Israelite city of Jabesh Gilead, offering them a horrifying ultimatum: surrender, and every man would have his right eye gouged out as a sign of their humiliation. When news of this atrocity reached Saul, the Spirit of God came upon him in power. The reluctant farmer was transformed into a decisive commander. In a fit of righteous fury, he butchered a pair of oxen and sent the pieces throughout the land of Israel with a stark message: "This is what will be done to the oxen of anyone who does not follow Saul and Samuel." The gruesome threat worked. A massive, unified army of Israelites rallied to his call. Saul led them in a forced march overnight and fell upon the Ammonite camp at dawn, winning a crushing and total victory. In the aftermath of this triumph, any lingering doubts about his kingship were erased. He was the hero, the deliverer, the king the people had longed for. For a time, Saul's reign was a success. He established a small standing army and waged effective campaigns against Israel's enemies, most notably the Philistines. But the very qualities that made him an appealing candidate, his humility and simplicity, soon gave way to a deep-seated insecurity and a rash impulsiveness that would prove to be his undoing. His is the story of a tragic hero, a man who fails to grow into the role he has been given. The first major crack appeared before a battle with the Philistines at Michmash. He was instructed by Samuel to wait 7 days for the prophet to arrive and offer the vital pre-battle sacrifices. But as the days passed and the Philistine army loomed, Saul's troops grew anxious and began to desert. Panicked and unwilling to go into battle without the proper rites, Saul lost his nerve and offered the sacrifice himself, usurping the authority of the prophet and priest. Just as he finished, Samuel arrived and delivered a devastating rebuke and the first hint of his doom. Because he had not trusted God's command, his kingdom would not last. The final, irrevocable break came during a war against the Amalekites. The divine command delivered through Samuel was absolute and severe. The Amalekites were to be placed under Haram, a ban of total destruction, as a deferred judgment for their ancient crimes against Israel. Nothing was to be spared, not man, woman, child, or beast. But Saul again disobeyed. After winning the battle, he spared Agag, the Amalekite king, as a trophy, and kept the best of the sheep and cattle, claiming he intended to sacrifice them to God. When Samuel confronted him, Saul's excuses were swept away by one of the most powerful speeches in the Old Testament. Does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as in obeying the Lord? Samuel declared, "To obey is better than sacrifice. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you as king." The break was absolute. Saul begged for forgiveness, even tearing Samuel's robe as the prophet turned to leave, but the verdict was final. Though he would continue to sit on the throne for years, Saul was now a hollow king, a man who had lost his divine anointing. The Spirit of God departed from him, and in its place, the text says, a tormenting spirit began to trouble him, plunging him into dark moods of paranoia, jealousy, and violent rage. A vacuum had been created at the heart of the new kingdom, and the stage was set for a new light to appear in the darkness of the court. A young shepherd from Bethlehem, brought in to play the lyre and soothe the troubled soul of the rejected king. While Saul, the anointed king, wrestled with the shadows in his own mind, a new light was quietly being kindled in the fields of Bethlehem. The kingdom needed a future, and the prophet Samuel, still mourning the tragic failure of the king he had chosen, was sent on a secret mission. He traveled to the house of a man named Jesse with a horn of anointing oil and a divine directive to select Israel's true king from among his sons. One by one, Jesse's sons, tall and impressive men, were presented to the prophet. Each looked the part of a king, but with each one, Samuel received a quiet, divine check. The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. After 7 of his sons had been passed over, a forgotten 8th was summoned from the fields. It was David, the youngest, a boy tending the sheep, described as ruddy and handsome. In this overlooked shepherd, Samuel recognized the chosen one. He anointed him with oil, and the scriptures say the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David from that day on. But this anointing was a secret, a seed of destiny planted in private. David's public entry into the story would be far more humble. He was brought to the royal court, not as a future king, but as a gifted musician, his skillful playing on the lyre, one of the few things that could soothe the tormented spirit of King Saul. He became the king's armor-bearer, a young man of talent and charm, quietly learning the ways of the court while serving the very man he was destined to replace. His meteoric rise from obscurity to national fame came in the valley of Elah, where the armies of Israel and the Philistines were locked in a demoralizing stalemate. The source of Israel's terror was a single man, Goliath of Gath, a Philistine champion of terrifying proportions. He stood nearly 10 feet tall, encased in a shell of bronze armor, wielding a spear with a head of iron. For 40 days he had strode out and taunted the armies of Israel, challenging them to send a champion to face him in single combat, blaspheming their God. The entire Israelite army, including King Saul, was paralyzed with fear. It was into this scene of national humiliation that David arrived, sent by his father to bring supplies to his older brothers on the front lines. David, filled with a youthful and zealous faith, was outraged. He could not comprehend how the army of the living God could be held hostage by this one man. His talk of fighting the giant was dismissed as boyish arrogance, but his conviction was so fierce that he was brought before the king. Saul, seeing only a boy, tried to equip him with his own royal armor, but it was heavy and unfamiliar. David cast it aside, choosing instead the simple tools of his trade, a shepherd's staff, a sling, and 5 smooth stones chosen from a stream bed. The ensuing confrontation became one of history's most iconic underdog stories. Goliath, seeing the young shepherd approaching, was insulted. "Am I a dog, that you come at me with sticks?" he bellowed. David's reply was a declaration of faith. "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty." It was a contest between brute force and agile faith. Before the giant could even close the distance, David slung a single stone with an expert's aim. It struck the giant on the forehead, and the great champion of the Philistines crashed, face down, to the earth. The shepherd boy had done the impossible. The Philistine army, seeing their hero fall, broke and fled. Overnight, David was a hero. His success, however, lit a dangerous fire in the heart of the king. As David returned from his victories, the women of Israel danced and sang, "Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands." That simple song of praise was poison to Saul's insecure and paranoid mind. The love he had for the young musician curdled into a murderous jealousy. More than once, as David played his lyre in the court, the king, in a fit of rage, hurled his spear, trying to pin the young man to the wall. David found a deep and loyal friend in Saul's own son, Jonathan, who loved David as he loved himself and recognized in him the future of the kingdom. But even Jonathan's protection could not keep him safe. Saul's obsession forced David to flee for his life, to become a fugitive and an outlaw. In the wilderness of Judah, he attracted a loyal following, a motley crew of some 400 men, those who were in distress, in debt, or discontented. From strongholds like the cave of Adullam, David and his private army lived on the fringes, a government in exile. During these years on the run, he proved his character. Twice he was given a perfect opportunity to kill Saul and seize the throne, and twice he refused, staying his men's hands because he would not harm the Lord's anointed. His restraint and loyalty stood in stark contrast to Saul's irrational hatred, and it won him the admiration of many. Saul's tragic story, however, could only end in one way. The Philistines marshaled their forces for a major assault, and Saul, now completely isolated from God's guidance, took the desperate and forbidden step of consulting a medium to summon the spirit of the dead prophet Samuel, who only confirmed his impending doom. On the slopes of Mount Gilboa, the Israelite army was routed. Saul's beloved son Jonathan was killed. Wounded and facing capture, the first king of Israel took his own life, falling on his own sword. The news of Saul's death reached David in the form of a young Amalekite seeking a reward, but instead of celebrating, David mourned deeply for the fallen king and for his dear friend Jonathan. With Saul gone, David was acclaimed king by his own tribe of Judah. For 7 years, a tense civil war simmered between David's house in the south and the remnants of Saul's house in the north. Eventually, David's strength and political skill won out. The elders of the northern tribes came to him in Hebron, and acknowledging his divine right and his proven leadership, they anointed him king over a finally united Israel. His first act as the new, undisputed monarch was a stroke of political and military genius. He marched his army against one of the last remaining independent city-states in the Central Highlands, Jerusalem. The city, held by the Jebusites, sat astride a strategic ridge and was famously difficult to conquer. It belonged to none of the 12 tribes, making it politically neutral ground. David's forces took the city, and he made it his new capital. By choosing this neutral site, he avoided alienating either the powerful northern tribes or his own southern kinsmen. He then solidified its importance by bringing the Ark of the Covenant, the sacred chest containing the tablets of the law, into Jerusalem with a massive, joyful procession. With this one move, David had centralized both the political and religious life of his kingdom. Jerusalem was now the city of David, the royal capital and the sacred center of the nation, and the shepherd boy from Bethlehem was now firmly on the throne of a new and powerful kingdom. King David had forged a kingdom with the sword, and for a time that kingdom was at peace, a small but powerful empire that dominated its neighbors. He had transformed a loose tribal confederation into a centralized monarchy and had made Jerusalem its heart and soul. Yet this golden age was not without its deep shadows, many of them cast by the king himself. His disastrous affair with Bathsheba and the subsequent murder of her husband, Uriah, was a profound moral failure that brought a curse upon his own family. The prophet Nathan's chilling parable and his stark accusation, "You are the man," made it clear that no one, not even the king, stood above the divine law. The fallout was devastating, leading to rebellion, civil war, and heartbreak, most notably the tragic revolt of his charismatic son Absalom, which nearly tore the kingdom apart. This legacy of internal strife culminated in a tense succession crisis as David lay old and frail on his deathbed. His ambitious elder son, Adonijah, made a bold move to seize the throne, gathering key military and religious leaders to his side. But a rival faction within the palace, led by the prophet Nathan and David's wife Bathsheba, moved faster. They orchestrated a desperate last-minute anointing of Bathsheba's son, Solomon, securing the dying king's blessing just in time to preempt the coup. Solomon's first acts as king were swift and ruthless, as he consolidated his power by eliminating his brother Adonijah and other rivals, ensuring his claim to the throne was absolute and uncontested. He was not the warrior his father had been. His genius would lie in administration, diplomacy, and commerce. Early in his reign, Solomon traveled to the high place at Gibeon to offer sacrifices, and there he had a dream in which God appeared to him, offering him anything he desired. Instead of asking for long life or riches or victory over his enemies, the young king made a humble and remarkable request. Give your servant a discerning heart to govern your people and to distinguish between right and wrong. This plea for wisdom so pleased God that he was granted not only wisdom beyond compare, but also the wealth and honor he had not requested. The proof of this gift soon became legendary. The famous story of the two women, both claiming to be the mother of a single infant, showcased his genius. By ordering the child to be cut in two, Solomon created a brilliant psychological test, revealing the true mother through her compassionate horror. News of this judgment spread throughout Israel, and the people held their new king in awe. Under Solomon, the kingdom of Israel reached the zenith of its power, prestige, and prosperity. His reign was the culmination of everything his father had built. He secured the borders, not through constant warfare, but through shrewd diplomacy and strategic alliances, often sealed by marrying the daughters of foreign kings. His most prestigious match was with the daughter of the Egyptian pharaoh himself, a sign of Israel's newfound status on the world stage. He became a master of international trade, building a navy of commercial vessels that sailed from the Red Sea down the coast of Africa and possibly beyond to a fabled land of Ophir. These ships returned laden with unimaginable treasures: gold, silver, precious stones, ivory, and exotic animals. Israel, situated at the crossroads of the great trade routes of Africa, Asia, and Europe, became a wealthy commercial hub, and Solomon's court was famed for its opulence and splendor. The crown jewel of his reign, however, was not his wealth, but his great building project, the construction of a permanent temple to the Lord in Jerusalem. It was a dream inherited from his father, David, who had been forbidden from building the temple himself because he was a man of war, his hands stained with too much blood. The task fell to Solomon, the man of peace. The project was a massive international undertaking that took 7 years to complete. Solomon entered into a treaty with King Hiram of Tyre, the great Phoenician sea power to the north, who supplied the priceless cedars of Lebanon and the skilled architects and craftsmen needed for the intricate work. Tens of thousands of laborers were conscripted to quarry the massive stones and haul the timber. The temple rose on Mount Moriah, a breathtaking structure of polished stone, paneled in fragrant cedar and overlaid with pure gold. Its inner sanctuary, the Holy of Holies, was a perfect cube, housing 2 enormous gold-plated cherubim whose wings stretched from wall to wall, sheltering the Ark of the Covenant, which was finally brought to its permanent resting place. At the temple's dedication, a great cloud of divine glory filled the sanctuary, and Solomon stood before his people and offered a majestic prayer, consecrating this house as the singular focal point of Israel's worship, the place where heaven and earth met. It was the absolute high point of the united monarchy. But this golden age came at a staggering cost, and beneath the gleaming surface, the seeds of the kingdom's undoing were being sown. The grandeur was financed by methods that would prove corrosive to the nation's soul. To man his massive building projects, Solomon instituted a system of forced labor, the corvée, conscripting 30,000 Israelites to work in Lebanon in monthly shifts. For a people whose founding identity was forged in their liberation from slavery in Egypt, this policy was deeply and spiritually offensive. Furthermore, he divided the country into 12 new administrative districts, ignoring traditional tribal boundaries, to levy heavy taxes to support his lavish court and building programs. The northern tribes, in particular, felt this burden fell disproportionately upon them, fostering a growing resentment against the monarchy in Jerusalem, which they saw as enriching itself at their expense. The most serious failing in the eyes of the biblical historians, however, was a spiritual one. Solomon's hundreds of foreign wives, symbols of his diplomatic prowess, became a spiritual snare. To appease them, he built altars and shrines to their native gods, Ashtoreth of the Sidonians, Chemosh of Moab, and Moloch of the Ammonites, on the hills surrounding Jerusalem. The text says that as Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart away, and he began to participate in their rituals. The king, who had been granted divine wisdom for his singular devotion to Yahweh, now presided over a capital city rife with idolatry. For this great sin, a prophet named Ahijah delivered a divine judgment. The kingdom would be torn apart. Though it would not happen in Solomon's lifetime, out of respect for his father David, 10 of the 12 tribes would be ripped away from his son and successor. The golden age was already rusting from within. The magnificent temple stood as a testament to his glory, but the unity of the people who had built it was beginning to fracture, and the long, slow decline was about to begin. The golden age of Solomon, with all its splendor and its oppressive weight, came to an end. The wise king died and was buried in the city his father had built, leaving his vast and increasingly fragile kingdom to his son Rehoboam. For the monarchy to be secure, the new king had to have his rule affirmed not only in his southern heartland of Judah, but also by the powerful and populous northern tribes. And so, Rehoboam traveled to Shechem, an ancient and symbolic city for the north, to receive their allegiance. He went expecting a coronation, but what he found was a confrontation. The northern tribes had not come simply to bend the knee. They had come with a list of grievances and a powerful spokesman who had just returned from political exile in Egypt. His name was Jeroboam, a man who had once been one of Solomon's own officials, a man who now embodied the north's deep-seated resentment. Their petition was direct and reasonable. "Your father put a heavy yoke on us," they told the new king, "but now lighten the harsh labor and the heavy yoke he put on us, and we will serve you." It was a plea for reform, a request to end the hated corvée, the forced labor gangs, and to ease the crushing taxes that had financed Solomon's glory. It was a crossroads moment, a chance to heal the growing rift in the nation through wisdom and grace. Rehoboam, uncertain, asked for 3 days to consider his answer. He first consulted the elders, the seasoned counselors who had served his father. Their advice was steeped in the wisdom of experience. "Be a servant to the people today," they urged. "Speak a kind word, grant their request, and you will win their loyalty forever." It was a call for humility and political shrewdness. But Rehoboam then turned to the companions of his youth, the arrogant young men who had grown up in the insular luxury of the royal court. Their advice was a disastrous cocktail of pride and bravado. They urged him to project strength, not weakness. Tell them, they counseled, my little finger is thicker than my father's waist. My father laid on you a heavy yoke. I will make it even heavier. My father scourged you with whips. I will scourge you with scorpions. In a moment of spectacular political folly, Rehoboam chose the path of confrontation. On the third day, he stood before the assembled tribes of Israel and delivered the insulting, threatening reply his young friends had scripted for him. The reaction was instantaneous and explosive. The delicate bonds that had held the United Kingdom together for a century snapped. The northern tribes erupted in a cry of open rebellion, a visceral slogan that severed their ties to the Davidic dynasty forever. What share do we have in David? What part in Jesse's son? To your tents, Israel. Look after your own house, David. When Rehoboam, failing to grasp the severity of the situation, sent out Adoniram, the very official in charge of the hated forced labor, the Israelites stoned him to death on the spot. Terrified, Rehoboam scrambled into his chariot and fled for his life back to the safety of Jerusalem. The united monarchy, the glorious empire of David and Solomon, was irrevocably shattered. In the aftermath, a new political map of the region was drawn. The 10 northern tribes, in a decisive act of independence, acclaimed the charismatic rebel Jeroboam as their king. Their new nation, the larger, wealthier, and more strategically important of the two, retained the historic name Israel. It controlled the fertile Jezreel Valley and the lucrative international trade routes. The southern tribes of Judah and the small adjacent tribe of Benjamin remained loyal to Rehoboam and the house of David. This smaller, more mountainous, and more isolated kingdom became known as Judah. Its primary assets were its rugged, defensible terrain, and crucially, the city of Jerusalem, with the established monarchy, the royal bureaucracy, and Solomon's magnificent temple. The single nation had become 2 rival sibling kingdoms. King Jeroboam of the new northern kingdom of Israel now faced a serious ideological problem. While he had political and military control, the religious heart of his people still beat in Jerusalem, the capital of his enemy. The law of Moses required all men to travel to the temple 3 times a year for the major pilgrimage festivals. Jeroboam astutely realized that allowing this would be political suicide. He feared that if his subjects continued to worship in the south, their loyalties would inevitably drift back to the house of David. To secure his new kingdom, he had to break Jerusalem's religious monopoly. His solution was to create a new, independent religious infrastructure for the north, a move that would be condemned by the biblical writers as the foundational sin of his kingdom. He established 2 new official worship centers at the extreme ends of his territory, one at Bethel in the south, a site sacred since the time of Jacob, and another at Dan in the far north. In each of these new national shrines, he erected a golden calf. This was a deeply provocative act. While some scholars suggest the calves were not meant as idols themselves, but as pedestals upon which the invisible Yahweh was thought to stand, much like the cherubim of the Ark in Jerusalem, the imagery was dangerously close to the great apostasy at Mount Sinai. To the historians writing from the perspective of Judah, it was a blatant and unforgivable act of idolatry. Jeroboam also appointed a new priesthood from outside the traditional tribe of Levi and created a new festival calendar that mimicked the one in Judah. This wasn't just a political schism, it was now a deep and permanent religious one. The nation was now divided not only by a border, but by competing altars. The Golden Age was over, and a long, troubled history of two brother kingdoms, locked in a cycle of rivalry, warfare, and shared destiny, had begun. While the southern kingdom of Judah settled into a long and stable, if not always righteous, dynastic succession under the descendants of David, the story of the northern kingdom of Israel was one of chronic, violent instability. Born from a tax revolt, its very foundation was rebellion, and it lacked the two great stabilizing forces that Judah possessed: the unifying symbol of the temple in Jerusalem and the divine promise of an eternal dynasty to the house of David. Israel's history, therefore, became a bloody and chaotic saga of charismatic generals rising to power, only to have their families wiped out a generation or two later by the next ambitious strongman. The pattern was set almost immediately. The son of the kingdom's founder, Jeroboam, was assassinated by a commander named Baasha, who then systematically slaughtered every remaining member of Jeroboam's family to secure his own throne. A brutal but tragically common practice for seizing power in the ancient world. This cycle of coups, assassinations, and dynastic purges would define the political life of the northern kingdom for the next 2 centuries. Out of this turmoil, however, arose Israel's most powerful and internationally significant dynasty, founded by an army commander named Omri, who took the throne after winning a civil war. While the Bible gives him only a few verses, dismissing him as exceedingly sinful, archaeology and foreign records tell a different story. Omri was a master strategist and nation builder. His most lasting achievement was the construction of a new, magnificent capital city, Samaria, built on a commanding, easily defensible hill. This city became so synonymous with the northern kingdom that Assyrian records for the next 150 years would refer to the entire land of Israel as the House of Omri. He forged a powerful alliance with the Phoenician city-state of Tyre, the great maritime power of the age, and brought a period of stability and prosperity to the kingdom. His son Ahab continued these policies, but sealed the alliance with Phoenicia through a marriage that would plunge Israel into its most severe spiritual crisis. He married Jezebel, daughter of the king of Tyre. She was not merely a foreign princess, she was a fervent devotee and missionary of her native faith, the worship of the storm god Baal and his consort Asherah. With her came an entourage of hundreds of priests and prophets, and Ahab, to please his powerful wife, built a great temple to Baal in the heart of the capital, Samaria. Jezebel, a woman of iron will, went further. She launched a systematic persecution of the prophets of Yahweh, seeking to elevate Baal worship from a tolerated cult to the official state religion of Israel. The kingdom was now in a state of religious civil war, a battle for its very soul. The champion of traditional Yahwism, who rose to meet this challenge, was one of the most dramatic figures in the Old Testament, Elijah the Tishbite. He was not a court prophet, but a rugged, wild man from the wilderness, clad in animal skins, who seemed to appear from nowhere. He strode into the court of Ahab and announced a devastating multi-year drought, a direct challenge to the authority of Baal, who was supposedly the god of rain and fertility. The contest between Yahweh and Baal, between Elijah and the crown, came to a head in a dramatic public showdown on the slopes of Mount Carmel. Elijah stood alone before 450 prophets of Baal. He challenged them to a test. Each would prepare a bull for sacrifice, but light no fire. The God who answered with fire from heaven would be acknowledged as the one true God. For hours, the prophets of Baal danced and chanted, working themselves into a frenzy, even gashing themselves with swords and spears, but their God remained silent. Elijah, with a touch of gentle sarcasm, mocked them, suggesting their God was perhaps meditating, busy, or on a journey. Then it was his turn. He had his own altar and sacrifice drenched with 12 large jars of water, filling a trench around it. Then, in a simple, quiet prayer, he called on the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel. The response was immediate and terrifying. Fire fell from the sky, consuming not only the sacrifice and the wood, but the stones of the altar, the dust, and all the water in the trench. The people, seeing this, fell on their faces in awe, crying, "The Lord, He is God." It was a decisive public humiliation of Baalism. Yet despite this victory, the threat from the enraged Queen Jezebel forced Elijah to flee for his life into the southern wilderness, a man despondent and alone, until a personal encounter with God at Mount Horeb, not in fire or earthquake, but in a gentle whisper, renewed his spirit for the mission ahead. The end of the powerful house of Omri was as bloody as its beginning. Elijah's appointed successor, the prophet Elisha, set in motion a brutal coup d'etat by anointing an army commander named Jehu as the new king. Jehu was a furious and zealous man who drove his chariot, as the saying went, like a maniac. He launched a political and religious purge of unparalleled violence. He assassinated the reigning king, a son of Ahab, and then raced to the city of Jezreel, where the queen mother Jezebel defiantly adorned herself and faced him from a window. At Jehu's command, her own eunuchs threw her from the window to her death. Jehu's purge continued with the systematic slaughter of all 70 of Ahab's sons, the entire extended royal family, and anyone loyal to the old regime. He then cunningly trapped all the remaining priests and worshippers of Baal in their own temple and had them massacred. From the biblical writer's perspective, this bloody revolution was a divine judgment, a righteous and necessary act to cleanse the land of apostasy. But from a political and historical viewpoint, it was a catastrophe. The slaughter of the royal house shattered the vital alliance with Phoenicia and left Israel diplomatically isolated and vulnerable. Archaeological evidence confirms the consequences of Jehu's actions. On a famous Assyrian monument, the black obelisk of Shalmaneser III, King Jehu of the house of Omri, is depicted groveling on the ground, paying tribute to the mighty king of Assyria. The bloody purge, while ending official state-sponsored Baal worship, had critically weakened the kingdom, leaving it exposed to the growing shadow of the Assyrian Empire, a new and ruthless power rising in the east that would ultimately seal the northern kingdom's fate. As the northern kingdom of Israel lurched from one bloody coup to the next, a different story was unfolding in the smaller, more rugged kingdom of Judah to the south. Where Israel's history was a jagged line of charismatic generals and ephemeral dynasties. Judah's was a steady, unbroken thread. For nearly 400 years after the kingdom divided, an heir of King David would sit on the throne in Jerusalem. This remarkable stability was rooted in a powerful ideology, the divine promise made to David, the covenant that his royal line would endure forever. This, combined with the centralizing gravity of Solomon's temple, gave Judah an ideological anchor that its larger, wealthier, and more volatile northern sibling always lacked. While Israel was a kingdom in constant search of a king, Judah was a kingdom defined by its dynasty. In the early years after the split, the two brother kingdoms often existed in a state of hostility, with frequent border skirmishes draining the resources of both. But during the powerful reign of the Omride dynasty in the north, a period of détente and alliance began. King Jehoshaphat of Judah, a righteous and capable ruler, made a treaty with the notorious King Ahab of Israel. This political alliance was sealed with a fateful marriage. Jehoshaphat's son and heir, Jehoram, was married to Ahab and Jezebel's daughter, a princess named Athaliah. This union, designed to ensure peace, instead brought the violent and idolatrous politics of the north directly into the heart of the Davidic court in Jerusalem. The consequences of this alliance exploded in the wake of Jehu's bloody purge in Israel. When Jehu assassinated the king of Israel, his Judean royal nephew, King Ahaziah, happened to be visiting and was caught in the slaughter, executed as part of the Omride purge. This left a sudden power vacuum on the throne of Judah. The queen mother, Athaliah, daughter of Jezebel, and a true heir to her mother's iron will, saw her chance. In a move of shocking brutality, she seized power for herself and, to eliminate any rival claimants, ordered the execution of the entire Davidic royal family, all of her own sons and grandsons. For 6 terrifying years, it seemed that the line of David had been extinguished. A Baal-worshipping queen, the daughter of Jezebel, now ruled in Jerusalem, and the divine promise to David appeared to be null and void. But one infant prince had escaped the slaughter. The king's son, a baby named Joash, was rescued by his aunt Jehosheba, who was married to the high priest Jehoiada. For 6 years, they hid the child in a secret chamber within the walls of the temple itself, a bastion of Yahwism standing against the queen's paganizing influence. When the boy turned 7, Jehoiada orchestrated a brilliant and daring counter-coup. He gathered the captains of the guard, revealed the hidden heir to them, and armed them with the sacred spears and shields from King David's own time that were stored in the temple. On the Sabbath, they brought the young Joash out into the temple courtyard, placed the crown on his head, and anointed him king. The guards formed a protective shield around him as the people clapped and shouted, "Long live the king!" Athaliah, hearing the noise from her palace, rushed to the temple. Seeing the crowned boy king, she tore her robes and cried, "Treason! Treason!" But her reign was over. She was seized by the guards, led away from the sacred ground, and executed. The line of David was restored, and the priest Jehoiada led the people in a renewal of their covenant and a purging of the temple of Baal that Athaliah had built. The crisis was a defining moment for Judah, cementing the central importance of both the Davidic dynasty and the Jerusalem priesthood in preserving the nation's identity. Despite this dynastic continuity, the history of Judah was a checkerboard of righteous and wicked kings. The biblical writers who compiled the history in the Book of Kings evaluated each ruler by a simple, consistent standard. Was he faithful to Yahweh, and did he act decisively to purify the nation's worship? Many are praised for their personal piety, yet receive a demerit for one persistent failure. They did not remove the high places. Those Bamot were local, open-air shrines, often on hilltops that dotted the Judean countryside. While some may have been dedicated to Yahweh, they represented a decentralized folk version of the faith that competed with the official, centralized worship at the Jerusalem temple. These shrines were also easily corrupted by the rituals of the surrounding Canaanite cultures. Thus, even the good kings were often seen as falling short of a complete and total reform. The reigns of men like Asa and Jehoshaphat were periods of faithfulness and prosperity, while the reigns of others, like the later King Ahaz, were periods of rampant apostasy, where pagan altars were set up and the nation was led far astray. This official narrative of a constant struggle between pure Yahwism and paganism, however, likely simplifies a more complex religious reality. This is one of the more subtle historical questions of the period. Archaeology throughout the land of Judah has unearthed a vast number of small clay female figurines, believed by many to represent a goddess, likely Asherah, who may have been worshipped by ordinary people as a consort to Yahweh. The evidence suggests that for the average Judean, religion was a syncretic blend of the official monotheism promoted by the temple priests and prophets, and a host of older local traditions and household cults. The great religious reforms we will see later, under kings like Hezekiah and Josiah, were likely aggressive, top-down campaigns to impose a stricter, more centralized, and more exclusively monotheistic form of worship on a populace that had long been comfortable with a more fluid religious landscape. The southern kingdom of Judah, smaller and more insulated than Israel, was nonetheless engaged in a constant internal struggle for its own religious soul, a struggle that would determine its fate as it faced the same colossal imperial powers that were gathering on the horizon. In the turbulent centuries of the divided monarchy, a third power rose to prominence alongside the kings in their palaces and the priests in their temples. This was the power of the prophet. We have already seen them stride across the stage of history. Samuel, the kingmaker who anointed both Saul and David, Nathan, who dared to confront King David over his sin, and the wild, fiery Elijah, who single-handedly challenged the state-sponsored paganism of Ahab and Jezebel. These figures were not isolated anomalies, but representatives of a unique and potent institution in the life of Israel and Judah. The prophet, or Navi in Hebrew, was not primarily a fortune teller gazing into a crystal ball. He was understood to be a messenger, a spokesperson, a human being who had been called to deliver a divine word to the people, a word that was often challenging, uncomfortable, and deeply unpopular. The prophets were the conscience of the nation. While the kings concerned themselves with politics, treaties, and warfare, and the priests administered the rituals of the temple, the prophet's singular focus was the health of the covenant, that foundational relationship between God and Israel. They were social critics and spiritual watchdogs, and they consistently measured the behavior of their society against the strict ethical and religious demands of the Mosaic Law. Their message, in its essence, was almost always a passionate and desperate call to return. Return to true worship, return to the care of the poor and the vulnerable, return to the exclusive allegiance that the covenant demanded. It was a dangerous calling that often placed them in direct opposition to the powerful, branding them as dissenters and troublemakers. In the northern kingdom of Israel, this prophetic tradition flourished. After Elijah was taken up in a whirlwind, his mantle fell upon his chosen successor, Elisha, who became a key figure in the nation's political life, anointing the usurper Jehu and advising kings in military matters. But in the 8th century BCE, a new type of prophet emerged, one whose powerful oracles were not only spoken, but were also written down and preserved in books that would bear their names. The first of these was a man named Amos, and his message fell like a thunderclap on the northern kingdom. He was an outsider, a shepherd, and tender of sycamore fig trees from the southern kingdom of Judah, which gave his critique a sharp, uncompromising edge. He arrived in the north during the reign of King Jeroboam II, a time of unprecedented peace and prosperity. But Amos, with his outsider's eyes, saw that this affluence was built upon a rotten foundation. He stalked the marketplaces and religious centers of Israel, like the shrine at Bethel, and delivered a blistering tirade against the wealthy elite. He condemned them for their lavish lifestyles, their ivory-inlaid houses, and sumptuous feasts, which were financed by cheating, exploiting, and oppressing the poor. His poetry is filled with vivid, searing images of injustice. But his critique went deeper. He saw that their religious observance, meticulous as it was, had become a hollow sham, a smokescreen to hide their moral corruption. In one of the most famous passages in prophetic literature, he channeled God's disgust with their empty piety. I despise your religious festivals. Away with the noise of your songs. I will not listen to the music of your harps. But let justice roll on like a river, righteousness like a never-failing stream. Amos was the first prophet to deliver the truly shocking message that God would use a foreign power, the terrifying Assyrian Empire, as his instrument of judgment to punish his own chosen people and send them into exile. He was followed by the prophet Hosea, a native of the northern kingdom, whose message was more intimate, but no less searing. His own life became a painful metaphor for the nation's broken covenant. He was commanded by God to marry a prostitute named Gomer, and her repeated acts of unfaithfulness became a living parable of Israel's own spiritual adultery, their chasing after the Baal cults. Yet through the heartbreak of his personal life, Hosea articulated one of the deepest themes in Israelite theology: God's heartbroken but relentless love for his people, a love he called chesed, a steadfast, loyal, covenantal love that would not let them go, promising that even after judgment there could be restoration. As these prophets were warning the north of its impending doom, a different kind of prophet was at work in the southern kingdom of Judah. Isaiah was no rustic shepherd. He was a sophisticated, highly educated man of aristocratic standing, a counselor who moved comfortably in the royal court of Jerusalem for decades. His calling was a terrifying vision of God, high and exalted, enthroned in the temple, a vision that left him utterly undone by his own and his nation's sinfulness. Isaiah's message was tailored to Judah's unique situation. Like Amos, he condemned the social injustice he saw in the capital, but his primary political message was a radical call to trust in Yahweh alone for national security. As the Assyrian war machine began to march across the Near East, Judah's kings were tempted to join defensive alliances with Egypt and other small nations. Isaiah consistently preached against this, arguing that such alliances showed a lack of faith and would ultimately fail. Trust in God, not in chariots, was his refrain. He spoke of a holy remnant that would survive the coming judgment and gave the kings of Judah magnificent visions of a future messianic king from David's line who would one day rule in perfect justice and peace. This phenomenon of classical prophecy is one of the most distinctive features of ancient Israel. Other nations had diviners who would read omens for kings, but none had this tradition of independent moral critics who spoke to king and commoner alike. They were a revolutionary force, interpreting history not as a series of random events, but as a moral drama in which the nation's fate was tied directly to its faithfulness to the covenant. Their warnings, long ignored by the prosperous and powerful, were about to be vindicated in the most terrible way imaginable. The storm that Amos had seen gathering on the horizon was about to break upon the northern kingdom of Israel. The warnings of the prophets, once dismissed as the ravings of doomsayers, were about to be vindicated by the arrival of a new and terrifying force on the world stage. From the plains of northern Mesopotamia, the Neo-Assyrian Empire had emerged, a civilization that had honed warfare into a science of brutal efficiency. They were unlike any empire that had come before. Their vast armies, equipped with iron weapons, formidable cavalry, and sophisticated siege engines, were the most advanced military machine of their day. But their true genius lay in a calculated policy of psychological warfare and political control. The Assyrians ruled by terror, their conquests followed by mass deportations, a deliberate strategy designed to shatter the identities of conquered peoples and extinguish any hope of future rebellion. This was the superpower whose shadow now loomed over the small squabbling kingdoms of Israel and Judah. For these two sibling kingdoms, foreign policy had become a frantic and desperate balancing act. They were caught in the geopolitical vice between two great powers, the Assyrian behemoth to the northeast and the ancient, often slumbering, power of Egypt to the southwest. Their only options were to bow down and pay the crippling annual tribute to the Assyrian king, or to rebel and place their faith in the notoriously unreliable promises of military aid from Egypt. After the death of its last strong king, Jeroboam II, the northern kingdom of Israel descended into a period of political anarchy, with a series of kings rising and falling by assassination. This internal weakness left it fatally exposed. The king of Israel at the time, a man named Pekah, chose the path of defiance. He forged an alliance with the neighboring kingdom of Aram Damascus and tried to force King Ahaz of Judah to join their anti-Assyrian coalition. In Jerusalem, King Ahaz was gripped by panic. The combined armies of Israel and Aram were marching on his capital. He had the prophet Isaiah in his court, who was imploring him to stand firm and trust in God alone for deliverance. But Ahaz chose what he saw as the pragmatic path. In a decision that would have catastrophic consequences for the entire region, he ignored Isaiah and sent a desperate appeal to the emperor of Assyria, Tiglath-Pileser III. Along with his plea for help, he sent a massive tribute, stripping the treasures from both the royal palace and the holy temple to buy the emperor's favor. He voluntarily placed his kingdom of Judah under the Assyrian yoke, becoming a loyal vassal in exchange for protection from his northern neighbors. The Assyrian emperor was more than happy to oblige. His response was swift and devastating. Around 733 BCE, the Assyrian army swept into the region. They conquered Damascus, executed its king, and then turned on the northern kingdom of Israel. They annexed all of its northern territories, the fertile lands of the Galilee, and all of its territory east of the Jordan River. The kingdom of Israel was dismembered, reduced to a small rump state centered on its capital, Samaria. And now, the Israelites got their first taste of Assyria's signature policy. Tiglath-Pileser began the first wave of deportations, uprooting the ruling classes and skilled workers from the conquered territories, and scattering them to distant corners of his empire, replacing them with foreign captives from other lands. The goal was simple and brutal: to erase a people's connection to their land, and with it, their identity. On the throne of the shrunken Israelite kingdom, the Assyrians placed a puppet king named Hoshea. For a few years, he dutifully paid the annual tribute, but eventually, he too made a fatal gamble on rebellion. He stopped sending the tribute and made secret overtures to Egypt for an alliance. The Assyrian response was final. The new emperor, Shalmaneser V, invaded what was left of Israel and laid siege to the capital city of Samaria. For 3 long and agonizing years, the Siddu held out. Inside those magnificent walls built by Omri, the people endured the horrors of a protracted siege, starvation, disease, and the slow, grinding erosion of all hope. Finally, in the year 722 BCE, the walls were breached and the city fell. The Assyrian emperor Sargon II, who succeeded Shalmaneser during the siege, boasted of the victory in his royal inscriptions, a record that provides stunning external confirmation of the biblical account. He claims to have taken 2,290 captives from Samaria, deporting them to the far reaches of the empire, to settlements in northern Mesopotamia and the mountains of Media in modern-day Syria and Iran. This was the final, unceremonious end of the northern kingdom of Israel, which disappeared from history after an existence of just over 2 centuries. Sargon then repopulated the desolate land with exiles from other conquered territories like Babylonia and Syria. The Israelite peasants who were not deported, the people of the land, eventually intermarried with these foreign settlers, creating a new mixed population that would become known as the Samaritans. The 27,290 deportees, the elite of the 10 tribes of the north, simply vanished. Unlike the later Judean exiles in Babylon, who would maintain their identity and community, the northern Israelites seem to have assimilated and disappeared into the vast multicultural landscape of the Assyrian Empire. Their tragic fate gave rise to one of history's most enduring legends, the mystery of the 10 lost tribes. For millennia, adventurers, scholars, and mystics have searched for them, and communities from Ethiopia to India to Japan have laid claim to this ancient heritage. The historical reality is likely less romantic. They weren't so much lost as they were systematically erased. The brutal efficiency of the Assyrian deportation policy worked exactly as intended. Severed from their land, their leadership, and their national institutions, they were absorbed into the surrounding cultures within a few generations. The prophetic warnings of Amos and Hosea had been fulfilled with terrifying precision. The northern kingdom was gone, its people scattered like seeds in the wind, leaving their younger sibling, the tiny kingdom of Judah, to stand alone and trembling in the long, dark shadow of Assyria. With the northern kingdom of Israel erased from the map, its people scattered across a vast empire, the small, solitary kingdom of Judah was left to navigate the treacherous currents of the New World Order. For decades, it survived as a loyal vassal state, paying a heavy annual tribute to the Assyrian emperor in Nineveh. During the reign of the apostate King Ahaz, who had first submitted to Assyria, Judean culture and religion became heavily influenced by its imperial overlords. But upon Ahaz's death, his son Hezekiah ascended the throne, and with him came a surge of religious and nationalistic fervor. He was everything his father was not, a zealous, devout reformer determined to purify his kingdom and restore its covenantal integrity. Hezekiah's reign began with a sweeping religious revolution. He reopened the doors of the Jerusalem temple, which his father had neglected and defiled, and led the priests and Levites in a grand ceremony of ritual purification. He then took a step that was far more radical and politically charged than anything his predecessors had attempted. He launched a nationwide campaign to destroy the Bamot, the high places, the local hilltop shrines that had been a feature of Israelite worship for centuries. His goal was to centralize all worship in the one place sanctioned by the law, the temple in Jerusalem. He even smashed a revered religious relic, the bronze serpent that Moses himself had made in the wilderness, because the people had begun to worship it as an idol. It was a top-to-bottom effort to purge the kingdom of all pagan and syncretistic practices. This religious purification was intertwined with a bold political rebellion. Buoyed by his faith and likely spurred on by anti-Assyrian factions at court, Hezekiah made the fateful decision to stop paying tribute to the emperor of Assyria. He began to fortify his cities, build up his army, and seek alliances, preparing for the inevitable and furious response from the world's greatest military power. That response came in the year 701 BCE. The formidable Assyrian emperor, Sennacherib, marched his army into Judah with overwhelming force. The campaign was a brutal success. The Assyrians swept through the countryside, devastating the kingdom. This event is not only described in the Bible, it is vividly documented by the Assyrians themselves. On a magnificent clay monument known as the Sennacherib Prism, the emperor boasts of his victory. As for Hezekiah the Judahite, he inscribed, I laid siege to 46 of his strong cities and conquered them. Himself I made a prisoner in Jerusalem, his royal residence, like a bird in a cage. This stunning archaeological find provides an independent and chilling confirmation of the biblical account. As the Assyrian war machine closed in on Jerusalem, Hezekiah scrambled to prepare the capital for a siege. He reinforced the city's fortifications, constructing a new, massive, broad wall to enclose a vulnerable suburb, a wall that archaeologists have since unearthed in Jerusalem. His most ingenious preparation was an astonishing feat of engineering, Hezekiah's tunnel. He ordered his engineers to carve a winding 1,150-foot tunnel through solid rock diverting the water of the Gihon spring from outside the city walls to a reservoir, the Pool of Siloam, safely inside. This secured a fresh water supply for the city, a critical factor in surviving a long siege. The Assyrian army surrounded Jerusalem, and their commander, the Rabshakes, engaged in a masterful display of psychological warfare, shouting threats and propaganda in perfect Hebrew to the soldiers on the city walls, trying to demoralize them into surrendering. But Hezekiah, counseled by the prophet Isaiah, held firm. Isaiah delivered a defiant oracle, promising that God would defend the city and that the Assyrian king would return home without ever firing an arrow into Jerusalem. And then something remarkable happened. The biblical narrative describes a miraculous deliverance. The angel of the Lord swept through the Assyrian camp overnight, striking down 185,000 soldiers. The vast army was decimated, and Sennacherib was forced to withdraw. Here lies a fascinating historical mystery. Sennacherib's own record, while boasting of trapping Hezekiah like a bird in a cage, conspicuously fails to mention the one thing that would have mattered most: the capture of Jerusalem. This silence is telling. While the biblical account speaks of a miracle, many historians speculate that the Assyrian army may have been struck by a devastating plague, a common occurrence for large armies in the field. Whatever the specific cause, Jerusalem, alone among the great capitals of the region, had stared into the face of the Assyrian war machine and survived. Hezekiah's victory, however, provided only a temporary reprieve. His son Manasseh's long reign was a 55-year period of catastrophic religious and moral decline, a complete reversal of his father's reforms. But after him, one last great reformer king arose, the young Josiah. Crowned as a boy, Josiah grew into a man of passionate faith. During a project to repair the temple, the high priest discovered a book of the law, widely believed by scholars to be a form of the book of Deuteronomy. When the scroll was read to Josiah, he was so distraught by how far Judah had strayed from its teachings that he tore his robes and launched the most systematic and ruthless religious reform in his nation's history. He went far beyond Hezekiah, traveling throughout the land and even into the former territories of the northern kingdom to utterly destroy every pagan altar, idol, sacred pole, and high place. He then gathered the entire nation in Jerusalem for a magnificent Passover celebration, renewing the covenant between the people and their God. For a brief, hopeful moment under Josiah, it seemed a new golden age was dawning. The once mighty Assyrian Empire was now in its death throes, crumbling from within, and a power vacuum was opening up. But just as quickly as this hope appeared, it was extinguished. The king of Egypt marched his army north to aid the Assyrians in a final battle against a new rising power, the Babylonians. Josiah, in a foolish and fatal act of political miscalculation, tried to intercept the Egyptian army at Megiddo and was killed. His death left the kingdom leaderless and vulnerable, standing directly in the path of the next great imperial storm. The death of the righteous King Josiah on the battlefield of Megiddo was more than a personal tragedy. It was the death of a dream. The brief, hopeful dawn of his reform was swallowed by the harsh geopolitical twilight descending upon the Near East. The mighty Assyrian Empire, the longtime oppressor, had finally collapsed, but the power vacuum it left was being filled by two ferocious contenders. The ancient kingdom of Egypt sought to reassert its old imperial claims over the Levant, while from the east, the Neo-Babylonian Empire, which had helped to crush Assyria, was rising with astonishing speed and ambition. The kingdom of Judah, now led by a succession of weak and feckless kings, was a tiny pawn caught in the middle of their titanic struggle for supremacy. The decisive moment came in 605 BCE at the Battle of Carchemish on the banks of the Euphrates River in northern Syria. There, the Babylonian crown prince, a military genius named Nebuchadnezzar II, won a crushing victory over the combined armies of Egypt and the last Assyrian remnants. The battle redrew the map of the ancient world, establishing Babylon as the undisputed new superpower. Judah, which had been an Egyptian vassal since Josiah's death, was now forced to switch its allegiance. Its king, Jehoiakim, bent to the knee and became a vassal of Nebuchadnezzar. But the spirit of rebellion, fanned by nationalist pride and the deceptive promises of Egyptian aid, still flickered in Jerusalem. Against the stark warnings of the prophet Jeremiah, who tirelessly preached that submission to Babylon was God's will and the only path to survival, King Jehoiakim made a disastrous choice. After a few years of paying tribute, he rebelled. Nebuchadnezzar, now the powerful emperor of Babylon, responded with methodical patience. In 597 BCE, his army appeared before the walls of Jerusalem. By this time, Jehoiakim was dead, and his 18-year-old son, Jehoiakim, had been on the throne for only 3 months. Seeing the hopelessness of the situation, the young king surrendered. This time, Nebuchadnezzar's punishment was surgical but severe. He did not destroy the city, but instead carried out a strategic deportation designed to cripple the kingdom and remove its leadership class. The young king Jehoiakim, the queen mother, the entire royal court, the top military officers, and all of the city's skilled artisans and craftsmen, the Bible numbers them at 10,000, were marched off into exile in Babylon. Among them was a young priest named Ezekiel, who would become one of the great prophets of the exile. Nebuchadnezzar then placed the former king's uncle, Zedekiah, on the throne as a puppet ruler, forcing him to swear a solemn oath of loyalty over holy texts. For nearly a decade, Zedekiah kept his oath. He was a weak, vacillating man, perpetually caught between the prophet Jeremiah's counsel of submission and the relentless pressure from a hawkish, pro-Egyptian faction of nobles at court who saw vassalage as a national humiliation. The exiles in Babylon, meanwhile, considered the captive Jehoiakim to be their true king, further undermining Zedekiah's authority. Eventually, the pressure became too much. Deceived by yet another empty promise of military support from Egypt, King Zedekiah broke his sacred oath and made the final fatal mistake of rebelling against the Babylonian Empire. When news of this betrayal reached Nebuchadnezzar, his patience was at an end. He returned to Judah with the full might of his army, this time not to discipline, but to annihilate. A brutal, suffocating siege was laid around Jerusalem. For 18 months, the city was slowly strangled. The prophet Jeremiah, who remained in the city, and the author of the Book of Lamentations, described the unimaginable horrors. Food supplies running out, the wealthy bartering their treasures for a scrap of bread, the city descending into starvation so severe that mothers resorted to cannibalizing their own children. An Egyptian army briefly appeared on the horizon, forcing the Babylonians to temporarily lift the siege and giving the city a fleeting, desperate moment of hope. But the Egyptians were quickly swept aside, and the Iron Ring closed around Jerusalem once more. In the summer of 586 BCE, the Babylonian siege engines finally breached the city's northern wall. Chaos and slaughter erupted as the soldiers poured into the streets. King Zedekiah and a small contingent of soldiers managed to escape through a breach in the opposite wall under the cover of darkness, but they were hunted down on the plains of Jericho. The last king of Judah was dragged before Nebuchadnezzar at his headquarters in Syria. There, he suffered a fate designed to be a terrifying political statement. He was forced to watch as his sons were executed before him, and then, with that image of slaughter being the last thing he would ever see, his own eyes were put out. Blinded and in chains, the last heir of King David was led away to die in a Babylonian prison. A month later, Nebuzaradan, the captain of Nebuchadnezzar's imperial guard, arrived in the conquered city to carry out the final phase of its destruction. His men systematically stripped Solomon's temple of every last vestige of its treasure, a process that had begun with the first deportation. They broke up the great bronze pillars and the ceremonial sea, hauling away the accumulated wealth of 4 centuries. Then came the ultimate act of destruction, an event of shattering theological significance for the people of Judah. They set fire to the house of the Lord, the magnificent temple of Solomon, the sacred space that was believed to be the literal dwelling place of God on earth. They also burned the royal palace and the homes of the nobility, and for good measure, tore down the city's formidable defensive walls. A second, larger deportation of the remaining citizens followed. Only a remnant of the poorest peasants were left behind to tend the vineyards and fields. The kingdom of Judah was no more. Jerusalem was a smoldering, depopulated ruin. The land, the monarchy, and the temple, the 3 pillars of their covenant identity, were all gone. This was the cataclysm that should have been their end. For the broken exiles beginning their long, sorrowful march eastward, the only question that remained was whether their God had abandoned them, or if somehow a future was still possible in the strange land of Babylon. The long, dusty march from the hills of Judah to the plains of Mesopotamia was a journey from one world to another. The exiles left behind a smoldering ruin, a small, devastated kingdom on the fringe of the civilized world, and arrived at the vibrant, overwhelming center of it. They were settled in the heartland of the Babylonian Empire, a land of ancient cities, intricate canal systems, and towering ziggurats. The capital city, Babylon, was the largest and most magnificent city on earth, a dazzling metropolis of glazed brick walls, monumental gates like the famous Ishtar Gate, adorned with blue-laced lions and dragons, and legendary terraced gardens that seemed to hang in the air. This grandeur was intentional. It was designed to awe and intimidate conquered peoples, to impress upon them the supreme power of the Babylonian gods, especially the chief deity, Marduk, and to encourage them to forget their old, defeated homes and assimilate into the glorious culture of the victors. For the Judean exiles, the shock was profound. It precipitated the greatest theological crisis in their history. Their entire faith had been built on a series of tangible promises: a land promised to Abraham, an eternal dynasty promised to David, and a temple in Jerusalem that was the singular dwelling place of their God, Yahweh. Now, the land was lost. The last king of David's line was a blinded prisoner, and the temple was a pile of rubble. From a conventional ancient Near Eastern perspective, the conclusion was obvious. Marduk of Babylon had proven stronger than Yahweh of Judah. The temptation to abandon their defeated God and assimilate must have been immense, and it is certain that many did just that, their family lines melting away into the Babylonian landscape. The central, agonizing question that haunted the faithful remnant was captured in the mournful lines of their songs. By the rivers of Babylon, we sat and wept when we remembered Zion. How can we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? And yet, against all odds, they did not disappear. The exile, which should have been the end of their story, instead became its most creative and transformative chapter. They were forged into something new in the fires of Babylon. A crucial role in this transformation was played by the prophets. Jeremiah, though not with them in Babylon, had sent a letter to the first group of exiles with a radical piece of advice. He told them not to expect a swift return, but to build houses, plant gardens, marry and have children, and to seek the peace and prosperity of the city where they lived. This was a revolutionary theological mandate for a diaspora community, to be a distinct people while also being a constructive part of a foreign society. Among them in Babylon was the priest and prophet Ezekiel, whose powerful and often bizarre visions gave the exiles a new way to understand their faith. He saw a vision of the divine chariot throne of God, not in Jerusalem, but right there, by the Chebar River, in the heart of Babylonia. The message was earth-shattering. God was not a territorial deity confined to the temple. His glorious presence had left the defiled temple before its destruction and was now with his people in their place of exile. This idea made their faith portable. Later, Ezekiel's vision of a valley of dry bones reassembling into a vast army offered a powerful and unforgettable promise of national resurrection, a hope that God could bring life from the ashes of their utter destruction. With the temple gone, the entire sacrificial system, the central ritual of their religion, came to a halt. This forced another profound innovation. The community began to gather, perhaps in homes or dedicated buildings, on the Sabbath day. In these gatherings, the synagogue, they replaced animal sacrifice with a new kind of worship, prayer, the singing of psalms, and most importantly, the reading and study of their sacred texts. Religion shifted its focus from a single holy place to a holy book. Scribes, the learned men who preserved, copied, and interpreted these texts, rose in prominence, becoming the new leaders of the community. It was during this period that the scrolls containing their laws, histories, and prophetic oracles were gathered, edited, and woven together. The Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, and the great historical narrative from Joshua through the fall of the kings, began to take their final shape. This portable homeland of Scripture gave them a powerful anchor of identity. They now understood their own history through a new lens. The catastrophe was not God's failure, but God's righteous judgment on their centuries of unfaithfulness to the covenant. They were not, for the most part, slaves. The Babylonians settled them as communities in their own towns and agricultural colonies. Remarkably, we have a window into their daily lives from Babylonian sources. A collection of cuneiform tablets, known today as the Al-Yahudu tablets, Al-Yahudu being Babylonian for Judah town, record the business dealings of these exiles. They list names that are straight out of the Bible: Gedaliah, Hananiah, Netanyahu, as they lease land, pay taxes, and engage in commerce. This archaeological evidence shows a community that was integrating economically into Babylonian society while fiercely maintaining its own unique religious and cultural identity. They were learning how to be Judeans, how to be God's people, without a land, without a temple, and without a king. They were becoming a people of the book, defined by a shared memory and a shared hope. And while they built their lives by the rivers of Babylon, they oriented their hearts and their prayers toward the ruins of a city hundreds of miles to the west, nurturing a powerful, unyielding belief that one day the 70 years of exile prophesied by Jeremiah would come to an end, and God would restore them to the land of Zion. For nearly half a century, the Judean exiles lived and built their lives in the shadow of Babylon's splendor. The empire of Nebuchadnezzar seemed eternal, its power absolute. But empires, like all human creations, are mortal. After the death of its great conqueror, the Neo-Babylonian Empire began to suffer from a succession of weaker, less effective rulers. The last of these, a king named Nabonidus, was an eccentric figure, a religious scholar, more interested in the worship of the moon god Sin than in the traditional chief deity of Babylon, Marduk. His policies alienated the powerful and influential Marduk priesthood, creating a dangerous rift in the empire's ideological foundation. As dissent simmered within the capital, a new, formidable power was rising in the east, a power that would change the world. From the highlands of the Iranian plateau, the Persians, led by a king of extraordinary genius, began their meteoric ascent. His name was Cyrus, a figure who would become known to history as Cyrus the Great. He was a new kind of conqueror. Where the Assyrians and Babylonians had ruled through terror and forced assimilation, Cyrus built his vast Achaemenid empire through a revolutionary combination of military brilliance and unprecedented tolerance. He presented himself not as a destroyer, but as a liberator, a restorer of traditional order. By 539 BCE, his armies, having already conquered the powerful kingdoms of Media and Lydia, stood before the legendary, seemingly impregnable walls of Babylon itself. The fall of the world's greatest city was remarkably swift and bloodless. Ancient historians like Herodotus tell a story of incredible ingenuity. Cyrus's engineers diverted the flow of the mighty Euphrates River, which ran through the center of Babylon, into a marshland. As the water level dropped, his soldiers were able to march into the city on the dry riverbed, taking the capital by surprise during a great feast. The conquest was made easier by the fact that many inside the city, including the disaffected priests of Marduk, welcomed him as a deliverer from their own unpopular king. Cyrus had mastered the art of political propaganda, and he entered the city not as an enemy, but as the chosen instrument of Babylon's own god, Marduk. Soon after his conquest, Cyrus issued a declaration that was recorded on a small, barrel-shaped clay artifact that is now one of the most famous objects of the ancient world, the Cyrus Cylinder. This document, inscribed in Babylonian cuneiform, is a masterpiece of royal propaganda. On it, Cyrus proclaims his victory and outlines a startling new imperial policy. He declares that he is reversing the brutal practices of his predecessors. Instead of deporting peoples, He would allow them to return to their homelands. Furthermore, he would not only permit, but actively fund the rebuilding of their local temples and the restoration of their native cults. This was a policy of remarkable pragmatism. Cyrus understood that people who were free to worship their own gods in their own lands were far less likely to rebel. He sought to rule a peaceful, multicultural empire whose diverse peoples would all see him as their benevolent protector. While the Cyrus Cylinder does not mention the Judeans by name, the policy it describes provides the precise historical context for the astonishing event recorded in the Bible. The book of Ezra opens with the Hebrew version of this decree, a royal edict that must have seemed like a miraculous answer to decades of prayer. Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, "The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has appointed me to build a temple for him at Jerusalem in Judah. Any of his people among you may go up to Jerusalem in Judah and build the temple of the Lord, the God of Israel." For the exiles, this was a moment of profound theological significance. The prophet whom we now call Second Isaiah, speaking to the exiles in the years just before this, had even prophesied that God would raise up a foreign ruler named Cyrus, calling him his shepherd and his anointed one, his Messiah, to be the instrument of Israel's restoration. And now, unbelievably, it was happening. The edict went even further. Not only were the Judeans permitted to return, but Cyrus ordered that the sacred vessels of the temple, the golden and silver cups and basins that Nebuchadnezzar had looted and put on display in Babylon, were to be cataloged and returned to them. The long journey home was now not just a dream, but an officially sanctioned and imperially sponsored project. The reaction within the exile community was surely one of joy, but also of great uncertainty. Many had been born in Babylon. It was the only home they had ever known, and many had become prosperous there. Judah, by contrast, was a distant, desolate province, its capital still in ruins. The journey itself was a long, arduous, and dangerous undertaking. The first wave of returnees was not a flood, but a hopeful stream. The Bible records that a group of about 42,000 people, a minority of the exiles, chose to leave the relative security of Babylon and gamble on a new future in their ancestral homeland. They were led by a man named Sheshbazzar, a prince of Judah, likely a descendant of the last captive king, Jehoiakim. Entrusted with the returned temple treasures, this small, determined group began the long trek west. The 70 years of exile were over. They were leaving the rivers of Babylon behind, carrying with them a tangible link to their past and a powerful mandate to rebuild their future. They were a people heading home, but they would soon learn that the challenges of rebuilding a nation from rubble were in many ways more difficult than the pains of exile they had left behind. The journey from the heart of the Persian Empire back to the land of their ancestors was a long and hopeful one, but the reality that greeted the first wave of returning exiles was a sobering shock. The Judah they had sung about in their mournful songs by the rivers of Babylon was not the glorious kingdom of their ancestors, but an impoverished and neglected backwater province of the Persian Empire, now known as Yehud. Jerusalem was not an empty stage awaiting their arrival. It was a field of ruins, its walls broken down, its great buildings reduced to rubble. The land itself was sparsely populated, a patchwork of the poor Judean farmers who had never been exiled, and communities of Samaritans, Ammonites, and others who had moved into the vacuum. The grand, heroic homecoming they had imagined was instead a daunting and humble beginning. Their first priority, under the leadership of the governor Zerubbabel, a descendant of King David, and the high priest Jeshua, was not to rebuild their houses, but to restore their relationship with God. They cleared the rubble from the foundation of the old temple and built a new altar, reinstituting the daily sacrifices and celebrating the Festival of Tabernacles. It was a crucial first step, a reestablishment of their religious life. Soon after, they laid the foundation for the new temple itself. The moment was a poignant mix of emotions. The younger generation, who had never seen the first temple, sang and shouted with joy, but the older priests and elders, who remembered the scale and magnificence of Solomon's temple, wept aloud. They knew that whatever they could build now would be but a pale shadow of its former glory. The sound of joyous shouting mingled with the sound of bitter weeping, a perfect symphony for their bittersweet return. Their efforts immediately drew hostile attention. The leaders of the neighboring province of Samaria, the descendants of the Israelites who had remained and intermarried with foreigners after the Assyrian conquest, approached Zerubbabel. They offered to help with the construction, claiming, "We seek your God and have been sacrificing to him." But the returnees, determined to build a purified community, rebuffed their offer, creating a deep and lasting enmity. Spurned, the Samaritans and other local leaders began a campaign of harassment, intimidating the workers, and more effectively, writing letters to the Persian court accusing the Jews of rebuilding a rebellious city. This political intrigue worked. The Persian emperor ordered the work to cease, and for nearly 2 decades, the Temple of God remained a foundation stone, a symbol of stalled hopes, while the people turned to building their own homes. It was into this atmosphere of discouragement that 2 new prophets arose. Haggai's message was blunt and practical. He confronted the people's misplaced priorities. Is it a time for you yourselves to be living in your paneled houses while this house remains a ruin? He argued that the droughts and poor harvests they were suffering were a direct result of their neglect of God's house. Zechariah, his contemporary, offered a different kind of encouragement, delivering a series of strange and hopeful visions that promised a glorious future for a restored Jerusalem. Spurred on by this prophetic 1-2 punch, Zerubbabel and Jeshua defiantly restarted the construction. When challenged again by local officials, they appealed to the new emperor, Darius the Great, who ordered a search of the royal archives. Cyrus's original decree was found, and Darius not only reauthorized the project, but commanded that it be funded from the royal treasury. In 516 BCE, the Second Temple was finally completed and dedicated. It was not as grand as Solomon's, but it was a home for their God, a center for their worship, and a monumental achievement of a resilient community. Decades passed. The temple stood, but the community around it struggled. The spiritual and social fabric of the people was fraying. It was then that a second wave of leaders arrived. First came Ezra, a priest and a scribe of immense learning who had risen to a high position in Babylon. He was a man of the book, well versed in the law of Moses. He led another group of exiles back to Judah, not with a mission to build a structure, but to rebuild a people. He was horrified to discover that the community, including its priests and leaders, had begun to intermarry with the surrounding non-Jewish peoples. For Ezra, this was not a matter of racial purity, but of spiritual survival. He saw it as the very sin of assimilation that had led to the exile in the first place, a fatal blurring of the lines that kept Judah distinct as a covenant people. In a dramatic scene of public grief and repentance, Ezra led the community in a painful and radical act of purification, dissolving the mixed marriages to preserve their fragile identity. A few years later, the final key figure of the restoration arrived. Nehemiah was a Jew who held the trusted position of cupbearer to the Persian emperor Artaxerxes I in the capital city of Susa. When he received a report that the people of Jerusalem were still living in disgrace, their city walls still in ruins and its gates burned, leaving them vulnerable and shamed, he was heartbroken. Using his high office and his considerable diplomatic skill, Nehemiah received permission from the emperor to go to Jerusalem as governor, with the specific mandate to rebuild the walls. Upon arriving, he organized the monumental task with brilliant efficiency, assigning a section of the wall to each family and guild. Their work was relentlessly mocked and threatened by local rivals who plotted to attack the builders. Nehemiah responded by turning his workforce into a militia. Each of the builders wore his sword at his side as he worked. He wrote, with half the men standing guard while the other half built. In an astonishing 52 days, the walls of Jerusalem were complete. With the temple rebuilt and the city's walls secured, the physical restoration was complete. The spiritual restoration culminated in a great ceremony. Ezra, the scribe, stood on a high wooden platform and read from the book of the law of Moses to the entire assembled population, men and women, from early morning until midday. As they listened, the people began to weep, convicted by how far their lives had strayed from the words of the text. Through the work of these leaders, the foundations of post-exilic Judaism were laid. They were becoming a people defined not by a king or a border, but by their devotion to a sacred text, the Torah. The fragile community had been rebuilt, but it would soon face a new and dazzling cultural challenge sweeping in from the west. For 2 centuries, the restored community in Jerusalem and the surrounding province of Yehud lived a relatively quiet life under the vast, stable umbrella of the Persian Empire. Their world was small and inwardly focused, a temple state governed by the rhythms of the sacred calendar, the authority of the high priest, and the detailed precepts of the Torah. They were a people of the book, living according to their ancestral laws, largely left alone by their imperial masters. But in the 330s BCE, a political earthquake in the west sent a cultural tsunami rushing eastward that would shatter this quiet world forever. A young, brilliant, and impossibly ambitious king from the mountainous region of Macedon, Alexander the Great, crossed the Hellespont with his unstoppable army, and in a breathtakingly swift campaign, crushed the mighty Persian Empire. Alexander was more than a military genius. He was a fervent apostle of Greek culture. In his wake, the entire ancient Near East was pulled into a new, dazzling cultural orbit. The old world of Babylon and Persia was replaced by the world of Hellenism. As Alexander's armies swept through the Levant, Judea, like all the provinces of the former Persian Empire, passed into his control. Later legends would claim that the Jewish high priest, dressed in his full ceremonial vestments, met the great conqueror at the gates of Jerusalem, and that Alexander, so impressed by the vision, spared the city from harm. While the story is likely a pious invention, it captures the sense of awe that Alexander inspired. With his arrival, the Jewish people were thrust from their familiar world into a vibrant, challenging, and profoundly different civilization. Alexander's own empire barely survived him. He died of a fever in Babylon at the age of 32, and his vast conquests were immediately fractured as his ambitious generals, the Diadochi or successors, tore the empire apart in decades of savage warfare. Judea, because of its strategic location as a land bridge between Asia and Africa, found itself in a precarious position, caught in a century-long tug-of-war between the two most powerful of these new Hellenistic kingdoms, the Ptolemaic kingdom, based in Egypt, and the Seleucid kingdom, based in Syria. For the first 100 years, from roughly 300 to 200 BCE, Judea was ruled by the Ptolemies, who were generally tolerant overlords, content to allow the Jews to live under the authority of their own high priest and their own laws, so long as the taxes were paid. The challenge during this period was not one of military oppression, but of cultural seduction. Hellenism was a complete and compelling worldview. It brought with it the Greek language, Koine, which became the universal tongue of commerce and government. It brought the ideal of the polis, the Greek city, with its public square, its theater, and its most influential institution, the gymnasium. The gymnasium was the educational and social heart of Hellenistic life, the place where young men trained their bodies in athletics, often in the nude, a practice that was deeply offensive to traditional Jewish modesty, and trained their minds in Greek philosophy, rhetoric, and the epics of Homer. To succeed in this new world, to be seen as modern and civilized, rather than as a strange and insular barbarian, one had to embrace the ways of the Greeks. This dazzling culture presented the Jewish people with a profound choice, and it split their society down the middle. On one side were the Hellenizers, a growing party composed mainly of the wealthy, urban, aristocratic families in Jerusalem, including many of the priestly clans. They were attracted by the sophistication and opportunities of Greek culture. They adopted Greek names, spoke the Greek language, and advocated for reforming Judaism, for stripping it of its more peculiar customs to make it a more respectable religion in the cosmopolitan Hellenistic world. The center of their ambition was the gymnasium, and a powerful faction in Jerusalem began to lobby for the establishment of one right there in the holy city. On the other side were the traditionalists, known as the Hasidim, or the pious ones. Rooted more in the countryside and among the common people, they viewed Hellenism as a mortal threat. To them, it was simply a beautiful package for idolatry and paganism. They saw the gymnasium as a school for apostasy, where Jewish boys would learn to neglect the Torah, profane the Sabbath, and abandon the covenant sign of circumcision. They clung fiercely to their ancestral traditions, seeing any compromise as a betrayal of their God. This was a battle for the Jewish soul, a deep internal conflict between accommodation and resistance, tradition and modernity. Around the year 200 BCE, the political situation shifted dramatically. After a major battle, control of Judea was wrested from the Ptolemies by the Seleucid Empire to the north. The Seleucids were a less stable, more financially pressed dynasty, constantly at war with their neighbors, including the rising power of Rome in the west. Their rule would prove to be far more heavy-handed and interventionist than that of the Ptolemies. This political change fanned the flames of the internal Jewish conflict, as the rival factions of Hellenizers and traditionalists now competed for the favor of the new Seleucid king, seeking to use his power to advance their own agendas, particularly in the all-important and highly lucrative office of the high priest. The stage was now set for a catastrophic collision where the internal Jewish struggle for identity would merge with the ambitions of a foreign king, leading to an unprecedented explosion of persecution and rebellion. The fragile peace of Judea was shattered by the ambitions of a new king on the Seleucid throne, Antiochus III, a man so consumed by his own ego that he gave himself the title Epiphanes, meaning God manifest. He was a fanatical promoter of Hellenistic culture, and more pressingly, he was in desperate need of funds to pay the massive war reparations his empire owed to the rising power of Rome. He saw in the divided Jewish community and its wealthy temple a golden opportunity. The internal conflict within Judaism now exploded into open corruption. A Hellenizing Jew named Jason offered Antiochus a colossal bribe to be made high priest, deposing his own more traditionalist brother. Antiochus, needing the money, readily agreed. Jason immediately began a radical Hellenization of Jerusalem, building a Greek gymnasium in the very shadow of the temple, where young priests, stripped naked for sport, began to neglect their sacred duties in favor of the discus. A few years later, an even more extreme Hellenizer named Menelaus offered an even larger bribe and was installed as high priest by the king, even though he was not from the legitimate high priestly lineage. To pay his debt to Antiochus, Menelaus committed an act of unthinkable sacrilege. He plundered the golden vessels from the temple treasury. The situation had become a toxic brew of internal corruption and foreign interference. While Antiochus was away on a campaign in Egypt, a false rumor of his death spread, and the deposed Jason attacked Jerusalem to oust Menelaus. Antiochus, returning from a humiliating diplomatic defeat at the hands of the Romans, interpreted this internal squabble as a full-blown rebellion. In a furious rage, he marched on Jerusalem in 167 BCE and unleashed his army. Thousands were slaughtered, the temple was plundered yet again, and a permanent Seleucid military fortress, the Acra, was built to dominate the Temple Mount. But Antiochus was not finished. He decided to put an end to Jewish resistance once and for all by eradicating their strange and stubborn religion. In the first systematic religious persecution in Western history, he issued a series of decrees. Sabbath observance and the keeping of dietary laws were forbidden. All copies of the Torah were to be confiscated and burned. The rite of circumcision, the very sign of the covenant, was outlawed on pain of death. Mothers who had their sons circumcised were executed, with their dead infants hung around their necks. The ultimate abomination came when the Jerusalem temple was officially rededicated to the Greek god Zeus, and on its great altar, a pagan altar was erected on which unclean animals, pigs, were sacrificed. This was the abomination of desolation, an act designed to irrevocably defile the holiest site in Judaism and break the spirit of the people. The breaking point came not in the great capital, but in the small rural village of Modane. A royal official arrived and commanded the townspeople to offer a pagan sacrifice. The local priest was an elderly but revered man named Mattathias of the Hasmonean family. He staunchly refused. When another, more fearful Jew stepped forward to comply with the order, Mattathias was overcome with what the scriptures call zeal. In a stunning act of defiance, he drew his sword and killed the apostate Jew upon the altar, then turned and killed the king's official. With his 5 sons at his side, he tore down the altar and fled into the rugged Gophna hills, shouting a rallying cry that would ignite a revolution. Let everyone who is zealous for the law and who stands by the covenant follow me. Mattathias died soon after, but leadership of the growing rebellion passed to his 3rd and most brilliant son, Judas. Judas was a military prodigy, a master of surprise attacks, ambushes, and lightning raids. His nickname, Maccabeus, is thought to mean the hammer, for the crushing blows he repeatedly dealt to the forces of the empire. His army was not a professional force, but a small, zealous band of farmers and villagers, the Hasidim and others who chose to fight rather than betray their faith. Outnumbered and poorly equipped, they used their intimate knowledge of the terrain and their burning religious fervor to inflict a series of shocking and improbable defeats on the large, well-organized Seleucid armies sent to crush them. After 3 years of this relentless guerrilla warfare, Judas and his Maccabean fighters achieved what had seemed impossible. They drove the Seleucid forces from Jerusalem itself, bottling up the remaining garrison in the Acra fortress. They entered their holy city to find the temple desolate and defiled. With great reverence, they cleansed the sacred precincts, tore down the pagan altar, built a new one according to the laws of the Torah, and hammered out new holy vessels. On the 25th day of the Hebrew month of Kislev, in 164 BCE, exactly 3 years to the day after Antiochus had desecrated it, the temple was reconsecrated to the worship of the God of Israel. According to a later tradition, when the Maccabees went to relight the great 7-branched menorah, they found only a single small flask of sanctified oil, enough to burn for just 1 day. Miraculously, the flame did not die, but burned for a full 8 days, the time needed to press and consecrate a new supply of oil. This event is commemorated to this day in the 8-day Jewish festival of Hanukkah, the Festival of Lights. Judas the Hammer and his band of rebels had won the first and most important battle. They had not yet achieved political independence, but they had reclaimed their soul. The rededication of the temple was a moment of profound spiritual victory, but the war ignited by Mattathias and his sons was far from over. The Seleucid garrison still occupied the Acra fortress, a stone citadel looming over the Temple Mount, a constant and galling reminder of foreign domination. The rebellion, which had begun as a desperate fight for religious freedom, now began to transform into a calculated campaign for full political independence. Judas Maccabeus continued his guerrilla war against the empire, but he also demonstrated a shrewd grasp of geopolitics. Recognizing that his small band of rebels could not defeat the Seleucids alone, he sent an embassy to a new and rising power in the west, a republic whose legions were already beginning to dominate the Mediterranean world, Rome. This first tentative contact was a sign that Judea was being drawn into a much larger global arena. The struggle was costly. Judas's brother Eleazar was famously killed in battle, crushed beneath a colossal war elephant that he had heroically charged, believing it carried the enemy king. Eventually, Judas himself, the valiant hammer, was cornered by a superior force and died fighting, a devastating blow that nearly broke the rebellion. But the Hasmonean spirit was not extinguished. Leadership passed to Judas's younger brothers, first Jonathan and then Simon, who proved to be as brilliant in the arts of diplomacy and political maneuvering as Judas had been on the battlefield. They took advantage of the fact that the Seleucid Empire was now chronically unstable, racked by dynastic disputes and civil wars between rival claimants to the throne. Jonathan and Simon expertly played these factions against one another, offering their military support to one contender in exchange for ever greater concessions. In a pivotal moment, one Seleucid pretender appointed Jonathan as the high priest of Jerusalem to secure his loyalty. This was a hugely significant and controversial act. While the Hasmoneans were a priestly family, they were not of the traditional Zadokite lineage from which the high priests had always been chosen. By accepting this political appointment, Jonathan usurped the legitimate high priesthood, a move that, while securing power for his family, alienated many of his original pious supporters, the Hasidim. The Hasmonean revolt, born of zeal for the law, was now creating a new dynasty of priest kings. After Jonathan was treacherously captured and killed, the last of the 5 brothers, Simon, took command. He continued the same masterful diplomatic game until in 142 BCE he achieved the ultimate prize. The reigning Seleucid king, desperate for Simon's support, granted Judea full independence and withdrew his claims for tribute. Simon soon captured the Acre fortress, and his soldiers marched into the citadel with psalms and celebration, finally cleansing Jerusalem of the last symbol of pagan domination. A great assembly of the Jewish people formally acclaimed Simon as their high priest, was general, and prince, establishing the Hasmonean dynasty as the legitimate rulers of a newly independent Jewish state. For the first time in over 400 years since the destruction of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, Judea was free. Under Simon's son, John Hyrcanus, and his successors, the small state grew into an aggressive, expansionist regional kingdom. As the Seleucid Empire continued to crumble, the Hasmonean priest kings conquered surrounding territories, including Samaria to the north and Idumea to the south. In a move that was a radical and troubling departure from Jewish tradition, John Hyrcanus forcibly converted the conquered Idumeans to Judaism, a policy that demonstrated just how much the Hasmoneans had begun to resemble the Hellenistic kings they had once fought against. At its height, under the warrior king Alexander Jannaeus, the Hasmonean kingdom reached its greatest territorial extent, briefly ruling over an area that rivaled the fabled kingdom of David and Solomon. But this external success masked a deep and growing internal rot. The very family that had risen to power by fighting against Hellenization had become a thoroughly Hellenized dynasty. They lived like Greek monarchs, minted coins with Greek inscriptions, and relied on foreign mercenaries. Their usurpation of the high priesthood and their increasing worldliness created a deep rift in Jewish society. Out of this conflict, the major religious sects that would define Judaism for the next 2 centuries began to crystallize. The Sadducees, the wealthy priestly aristocracy, generally supported the Hasmonean rulers. The Pharisees, who were the spiritual heirs of the early Hasidim, were lay scholars of the Torah who commanded great respect among the common people. They frequently clashed with the Hasmonean priest kings, arguing that the offices of king and high priest should be separate. This bitter rivalry eventually exploded into a bloody civil war, with Alexander Jannaeus crucifying 800 of his Pharisee opponents. The liberators had become tyrants. The dynasty founded on religious piety was now tearing itself apart with secular ambition. After the death of a wise ruling queen, Salome Alexandra, her 2 sons, Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II, plunged the kingdom into a final, destructive civil war for the throne. In their lust for power, both brothers made the same fatal miscalculation. They each appealed to a powerful outsider to intervene on their behalf and settle the dispute. That outsider, the Roman general Pompey the Great, was already in the region, tidying up the remnants of the Seleucid Empire. He was more than happy to accept their invitation. The bitter irony was complete. Jewish independence, won through so much sacrifice, was about to be forfeited by the squabbling heirs of the very family that had won it. The self-destructive civil war between the 2 Hasmonean brothers, Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II, had turned their kingdom into a chaotic mess. Their appeals for Roman intervention did not fall on deaf ears. The master of the Roman East, the celebrated general Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, or Pompey the Great, was in the region, systematically dismantling the remnants of the Seleucid Empire and reorganizing its territories into Roman provinces. He was the ultimate arbiter of power, and into his camp in Damascus came the 2 squabbling Jewish princes, each laden with gifts and accusations, each trying to bribe the Roman general into siding with him. They were joined by a 3rd delegation, one that represented many of the Jewish people who were sick of the corrupt monarchy. Their request was startling. They asked Pompey to abolish the Hasmonean kingship altogether and restore the old system of governance by the high priest. Pompey, a master of political theater, delayed his decision. The more aggressive brother, Aristobulus, grew impatient and marched back to Judea to defiantly rally his forces. This act of insolence sealed his fate. In 63 BCE, Pompey marched his legions into Judea, while the faction supporting the weaker brother, Hyrcanus, opened the gates of Jerusalem to the Romans. The supporters of Aristobulus fortified themselves in the most defensible part of the city, the Temple Mount. The Roman army, masters of siege warfare, settled in for a fight. They began constructing massive earthen ramps to breach the high walls of the sacred complex. The Jewish defenders fought with desperate courage, but their piety proved to be a fatal weakness. The Romans noticed that while the defenders would fight fiercely if attacked on the Sabbath, they would not take action to stop construction work. Exploiting this, the Romans completed their siege works on the day of rest, and after 3 months, their battering rams smashed through the walls. A terrible slaughter ensued as Roman soldiers stormed the sacred courts, cutting down the priests, some of whom refused to stop performing the sacred rituals even as they were being killed. After the bloodshed, Pompey the Great, driven by a conqueror's curiosity, committed an act of profound and unforgettable sacrilege. He strode past the great altar and the golden menorah and entered the most sacred place in all of Judaism, the Holy of Holies. This was the innermost sanctuary of the temple, a space so holy that the Jewish high priest alone was permitted to enter it, and then only for a few moments on one day of the year, the Day of Atonement. The Romans, accustomed to temples filled with magnificent statues of their gods, must have expected to find some awe-inspiring image of the Jewish deity. Instead, Pompey found a small, dark, and entirely empty room. The Ark of the Covenant had vanished centuries before. The Roman historian Tacitus would later write of Pompey's astonishment at finding an empty shrine and vacant mysteries. To the Jewish people, this act of trespass by a pagan general was a deep and traumatic violation, a brutal demonstration that their God's holy house and their nation were now utterly powerless before the eagles of Rome. Pompey quickly imposed a new political order. The Hasmonean kingdom was dismantled. He stripped away all the coastal, northern, and eastern territories that the Hasmonean kings had conquered, reducing Judea to its ethnic heartland. He abolished the title of king. He took the troublesome Aristobulus and his family back to Rome in chains to be paraded in his triumphal procession, and he reinstalled the weak and compliant Hyrcanus Thesion not as a king, but merely as high priest and ethnarch, a client ruler with severely limited authority. After nearly a century of freedom, Judea was once again a subject nation, now a client state of the Roman Republic, its independence lost, its destiny now in the hands of foreign masters. The real power in this new arrangement, however, did not belong to the feeble Hyrcanus II. It was wielded by his cunning and ambitious chief minister, a man named Antipater the Idumean. Antipater was the quintessential political survivor, a man whose family had been forcibly converted to Judaism a generation earlier, but whose loyalties were entirely pragmatic. He skillfully cultivated his relationship with Rome, proving his usefulness time and again, especially to Pompey's rival and eventual successor, Julius Caesar. While Hyrcanus held the titles, Antipater held the power, and the Romans, who valued competence and loyalty above all else, were happy to let him run the country. As his influence grew, Antipater began positioning his own sons for power. He made his older son, Phasael, the governor of Jerusalem, and his younger, even more ambitious son, a man named Herod, the governor of the Galilee. The Hasmonean dream, which had begun in a blaze of pious zeal in the village of Modine, had ended in a pathetic whimper of fraternal jealousy and Roman domination. The dynasty had rotted from within, consumed by the very Hellenistic power politics it had once opposed. In their final, desperate quarrel, the last Hasmonean princes had committed the ultimate folly. They had invited the wolf to mediate a dispute between the sheep. Now, the wolf was in the fold, and a new and ruthless political operator, Antipater, was managing the flock for his Roman masters. His son Herod was already beginning to make a name for himself, and he would prove to be more cunning, more brutal, and more brilliant than anyone could have possibly imagined. The assassination of Julius Caesar in Rome sent shockwaves across the Republic, plunging the world into a new round of bloody civil war. In the small client state of Judea, this chaos provided both peril and opportunity. Antipater, the cunning Idumean who had been the real power behind the throne, was himself assassinated. His sons, Herod and Phasael, were left to navigate a treacherous political landscape of shifting loyalties as Roman warlords battled for control of the East. Their situation became desperate when the Parthian Empire, Rome's great rival, swept in from the east, conquering Syria and Judea. The Parthians installed a Hasmonean prince, Antigonus, on the throne in Jerusalem, and Herod's brother was captured and killed. Herod himself, now a landless fugitive with a Roman title and a price on his head, was forced to make a desperate flight for his life. Instead of accepting defeat, Herod undertook a daring journey to Rome itself. There, in the heart of world power, this ambitious Idumean prince brilliantly pleaded his case before the new masters of the Roman world, Mark Antony and Octavian. He argued that he was the only man with the will, the skill, and the loyalty to Rome to reclaim Judea from the Parthians and their Hasmonean puppet. Antony and Octavian, who valued ruthless competence, were convinced. In an unprecedented move in 40 BCE, the Roman Senate formally bestowed upon him the title Rex Judaeorum, King of the Jews. It was a stunning achievement, but the title was an empty one. Rome had given him a kingdom. Now he had to conquer it. For 3 years, Herod, backed by Roman legions, waged a brutal war against Antigonus to claim his throne. The conflict culminated in another devastating siege of Jerusalem in 37 BCE, at the end of which Herod finally became the undisputed, if widely hated, master of Judea. His long and dramatic reign would be a study in contradictions, a balancing act of magnificent achievement and monstrous cruelty. He was a man of immense talent, haunted by an equally immense insecurity. As an Idumean, he was viewed by many of his Jewish subjects as a foreign usurper, a half-breed with no legitimate claim to the throne of David. This deep-seated illegitimacy fueled a lifelong paranoia, an obsession with eliminating any and every potential threat to his rule, particularly from the last remnants of the Hasmonean dynasty he had displaced. To legitimize his reign, he married the beautiful Hasmonean princess, Mariamne. By all accounts, he was passionately in love with her, but his love was poisoned by a pathological jealousy. Convinced by court intrigue that she was plotting against him, he had her executed. This act seemed to unhinge him further, and a wave of terror followed. He systematically murdered anyone with a drop of Hasmonean blood, including Mariamne's grandfather, the aged and harmless former high priest Hyrcanus II. His paranoia eventually turned on his own family, and in his final years, he executed 3 of his own sons on suspicion of treason. The Roman Emperor Augustus, his friend and patron, was said to have quipped grimly, "It is better to be Herod's pig than his son." Yet this murderous tyrant was also one of the most brilliant and effective client kings in the history of the Roman Empire. For over 30 years, he kept the peace in a notoriously rebellious province. He was a masterful administrator, and his kingdom was fabulously wealthy, and above all, he was a builder. Driven by a desire to achieve immortal fame and to win the favor of both his Roman patrons and his Jewish subjects, he launched the most spectacular building program the land had ever seen. He built magnificent desert fortress palaces, like the dramatic clifftop citadel of Masada and the volcano-shaped Herodium, where he would be buried. On the coast, he constructed the entirely new city of Caesarea Maritima, a marvel of Roman engineering with a deep-water artificial harbor, a theater, and a grand temple dedicated to Rome and the Emperor Augustus. His crowning achievement, however, was in Jerusalem. To placate the Jews and to create a monument to his own grandeur, Herod undertook a colossal renovation and expansion of the Second Temple. The project was staggering in its scale. He doubled the size of the Temple Mount by constructing enormous retaining walls. The lower courses of the western wall that stands today are a remnant of this project, and building a vast platform on top. On this platform, the temple was rebuilt with gleaming white marble and plates of gold, surrounded by a series of magnificent colonnades and courts. The finished work was considered one of the wonders of the ancient world, a sacred complex of breathtaking beauty and size. It was this Herodian temple that stood in the time of Jesus and the early rabbis. It was an act of immense piety and even greater pride. Herod died in 4 BCE, a miserable old man consumed by a painful disease and his own paranoia. He left behind a land adorned with some of the most magnificent structures in the Roman world, but also a kingdom seething with resentment. He had held Judea together through sheer force of will, but he had never won its heart. His will divided his kingdom among his 3 surviving sons, none of whom possessed his political genius or his terrifying authority. The death of the great tyrant would finally unleash all the pent-up religious and nationalistic passions he had so brutally suppressed for a generation. Herod the Great, for all his cruelty, had been a brutally effective ruler, and his death in 4 BCE left a vacuum that his less capable sons could not fill. His kingdom was fractured between them, but their misrule was so profound that in the year 66 CE, the Romans finally lost patience. They deposed Herod's son Archelaus and converted the heartland of the Jewish state, Judea, Samaria, and Idumea, into a formal Roman province, to be governed directly by a Roman prefect. For the first time since the Hasmonean Revolt, the Jewish people were under the direct, daily rule of a foreign, pagan power, and the stage was set for a 60-year descent into one of the most violent and catastrophic rebellions in the history of the Roman Empire. Life under direct Roman rule was a constant friction of religious insensitivity and economic exploitation. The Roman governors stationed in the Hellenistic coastal city of Caesarea were often second-rate bureaucrats who had little understanding of or patience for the unique religious sensibilities of their Jewish subjects. Their corruption and occasional acts of sacrilege were a constant source of outrage. At the same time, the relentless burden of Roman taxation fell heavily upon the common people, creating a landscape of debt, poverty, and simmering resentment. This toxic atmosphere gave rise to a collection of revolutionary movements. Known collectively as the Zealots, these groups were animated by a fierce belief that to pay taxes to a pagan emperor was an act of treason against God, the one true King of Israel. Their slogan was, "No king but God," and they believed that a violent, apocalyptic war to overthrow Rome was not only necessary, but divinely ordained. Among them were the Sicarii, or dagger men, an extremist faction who engaged in urban terrorism, using small, hidden daggers to assassinate Roman officials and their Jewish collaborators in the midst of crowded festival gatherings in Jerusalem. The air was thick with messianic expectation, a fervent belief that a divinely empowered leader would soon emerge to destroy the legions of Rome and establish God's kingdom on earth. The final spark fell in the year 66 CE. The last Roman procurator Josias Florus, an exceptionally greedy and foolish man, plundered a large sum of silver from the temple treasury. When the people of Jerusalem protested with mockery and outrage, he unleashed his troops on the city, crucifying citizens and sacking homes. As the city teetered on the edge, the radical factions gained the upper hand. The priests in the temple were persuaded to commit an official act of rebellion. They ceased to offer the twice-daily sacrifice on behalf of the Roman emperor. This was, in effect, a declaration of war. The revolt exploded with astonishing speed. The Jewish rebels overwhelmed the Roman garrison in Jerusalem, slaughtered them, and seized control of the city. A small band of zealots even managed to capture Herod's seemingly impregnable desert fortress of Masada. Rome's initial response was complacent and clumsy. The Roman legate of Syria, Cestius Gallus, marched a full legion down from the north to quell the disturbance, but he bungled the assault on Jerusalem and was ambushed by rebel forces during his retreat, suffering a humiliating and catastrophic defeat. The sight of a Roman legion in full flight, its eagle standard nearly captured, was a stunning victory that electrified the Jewish population. It seemed to be a sign that God was on their side. Moderates were swept up in the revolutionary fervor, and a provisional government was formed in Jerusalem to manage the war effort. It was this government that appointed a young aristocratic priest named Josephus to command the rebel forces in the Galilee. In Rome, the Emperor Nero was enraged by the news. He turned to his most seasoned and unflappable general, a man of humble origins named Vespasian, and gave him a single task: crush the Judean rebellion. Vespasian assembled a massive army of 3 legions, some 60,000 professional soldiers, and, with his son Titus at his side, he began a slow, methodical, and brutally efficient campaign to reconquer the land. Starting in the Galilee, he advanced city by city, crushing all resistance. It was here that the rebel commander Josephus was captured. In a remarkable act of quick thinking, Josephus saved his own life by prophesying that Vespasian would one day become emperor, a prophecy that would, against all odds, come true. As the Roman war machine ground its way south, the provisional government in Jerusalem collapsed. The city descended into a horrific civil war as rival zealot factions, in a frenzy of apocalyptic madness, fought each other for control. They slaughtered not only each other, but any prominent citizen suspected of moderation, and in a truly insane act of self-destruction, they burned the city's vast grain reserves, ensuring that any future Roman siege would be accompanied by a devastating famine. In the year 70 CE, Titus, now in command after his father Vespasian had left to claim the imperial throne in Rome, arrived before the walls of Jerusalem. He laid siege to the city just before Passover, trapping a vast multitude of pilgrims within. The siege that followed was one of the most horrific in ancient history. Josephus, now an advisor in the Roman camp, chronicled the events in excruciating detail. The relentless assault of the Roman siege engines, the desperate, heroic counterattacks of the Jewish fighters, and the unspeakable suffering of the civilians inside the walls, who were dying by the thousands from starvation and disease. That summer, the Romans finally breached the city's defenses. The fighting was street by street, house by house, culminating in a final bloody stand on the Temple Mount. According to Josephus, Titus wished to preserve the magnificent temple, but in the chaos of the final assault, a Roman soldier hurled a torch into the sacred building. The flames, feeding on the ancient dry cedar wood, exploded into an uncontrollable inferno. The Second Temple, Herod's glorious creation, the heart of the Jewish faith for 6 centuries, was completely destroyed. The city was razed, its people were massacred or sold into slavery, and the Great Revolt was over. In Rome, Titus would celebrate his victory with a grand triumphal parade, an event immortalized on the Arch of Titus, which still stands today, its stone panels depicting Roman soldiers carrying away the sacred treasures of the temple, including the great golden menorah. The heart of the nation had been torn out, its ashes scattered to the wind. The destruction of Jerusalem in 70 CE was not quite the end of the war. While the capital lay in smoldering ruins, one last pocket of defiance held out, a symbol of impossible, tragic heroism. On the western shore of the Dead Sea, a sheer, isolated rock plateau rises 1,000 feet from the desert floor. This was Masada, one of Herod the Great's most magnificent fortress palaces, and it was now the last refuge for a band of nearly 1,000 Jewish rebels and their families. For 3 years they survived, a tiny, defiant island in a conquered world. The Romans, who could not tolerate such an open challenge to their authority, sent an entire legion to eradicate them. The task was monumental. Under the command of Flavius Silva, the Roman soldiers, with the help of thousands of prisoners of war, undertook an incredible feat of engineering. They built a colossal earthen ramp against the western face of the plateau. Day by day, the defenders of Masada watched as this ramp grew higher and higher, an inexorable tide of earth and timber rising to meet them. When the end was clearly inevitable, their leader, Eleazar ben Yair, gathered the people and, according to the historian Josephus, persuaded them that it was better to die as free people than to live as Roman slaves. That night, a terrible and orderly act took place within the fortress walls. The men embraced their wives and children for the last time, and then killed them. 10 men were chosen by lot to kill the remaining men, and one final man was chosen to kill the last 9 before taking his own life. The next morning, when the Roman soldiers finally breached the fortress walls, they were met not by the clash of swords, but by an eerie, unnerving silence and the sight of nearly 1,000 bodies. Masada fell, and with it, the last ember of the Great Revolt was extinguished. The catastrophe of 70 CE should have been the end. With the temple destroyed, the priestly class that administered it, the Sadducees, vanished from history. The zealot revolutionaries had been utterly crushed. But in the midst of the destruction, the seeds of a new kind of Judaism were being planted. A wise and respected rabbi named Yohanan ben Zakkai had, according to legend, been smuggled out of the besieged city of Jerusalem in a coffin. He made his way to the Roman leadership and received permission to establish a small academy for the study of the Torah in the coastal town of Yavne. It was here, in this quiet seaside town, that the work of reimagining Judaism for a world without a temple began. The rabbis of Yavne, heirs to the Pharisaic tradition, argued that prayer, study, and acts of loving kindness could now serve the same purpose as the sacrifices of old. They focused their energies on preserving and interpreting the sacred texts, creating the foundations of the rabbinic Judaism that would sustain the Jewish people for the next 2 millennia. For 60 years, a tense and uneasy peace settled over the land. But the trauma of the First War and the hope for a restored Israel still simmered beneath the surface. The final, fatal explosion was ignited by the Roman Emperor Hadrian. A great admirer of Greek culture, Hadrian decided to rebuild Jerusalem as a pagan Roman city to be named Aelia Capitolina. He planned to erect a grand temple to Jupiter on the very site of the destroyed Jewish temple. For the Jewish people, this was the ultimate blasphemy, an unbearable provocation. In 132 CE, a second great rebellion erupted. This was no chaotic uprising, but a well-organized war led by a charismatic and brilliant commander named Simon Bar Kokhba. His military successes were so stunning that the most revered religious figure of the age, Rabbi Akiva, proclaimed him to be the Messiah, the prophesied son of a star, Bar Kokhba, who would redeem Israel. For nearly 3 years, the impossible happened. Bar Kokhba's forces drove the Romans out of the land and established a brief, final period of Jewish independence, even minting their own coins stamped with the words, "For the freedom of Jerusalem." Hadrian, enraged, responded with overwhelming force. He summoned legions from across the empire, including his best general from as far away as Britain, and unleashed a campaign of annihilation. The Romans adopted a brutal, scorched earth policy, methodically destroying hundreds of towns and villages, wiping out the population. The war ended in 136 CE with the fall of the fortress of Betar and the death of Bar Kokhba. The devastation was almost unimaginable, far surpassing the destruction of the First War. Hadrian's vengeance was absolute. He was determined not just to crush a people, but to erase their very memory from the land. He rebuilt Jerusalem as Aelia Capitolina as he had planned, and forbade any Jew from entering the city on pain of death. And in a final, symbolic act of humiliation, he renamed the entire province, changing it from Judea to Syria Palestina, Palestine, a name derived from the Philistines, the ancient enemies of Israel. This was the true, traumatic beginning of the long diaspora. The center of Jewish life, which had been in its ancestral land for over a millennium, was shattered, and so our long story of ancient Israel comes to a gentle close. We have journeyed from a single family's tent in Mesopotamia to the courts of Egyptian pharaohs, from the fire of Mount Sinai to the splendors of Solomon's temple. We have seen a kingdom rise, divide, and fall, and we have heard the powerful voices of prophets and the clash of swords against Roman shields. The story of the ancient nation, the story of its kings and its temples, is over. But the story of the people, a people who now carried their homeland in a sacred book and in their hearts, was about to begin a new and very different chapter. Now, it is time to let the echoes of this ancient past fade into the quiet of the night. Wishing you peace and a deep, restful sleep.